and the perceptions that people with disabilities are not able to do things. So that is why we at RespectAbility care so much about representation of people with disabilities, both in front of the camera and behind the camera. So that is why we are so excited to have this panel. And I want to do a quick introduction of Jonathan Murray, although he probably needs no introduction. But since the launch of Real World on MTV in 1992 through his then company Bunham Murray Productions, Jonathan Murray has created and executive produced some of the industry's most innovative, unscripted entertainment television programs, including, and I'm sure many of you are aware of his show Born This Way, which documents the lives of 7 diverse young adults with Down syndrome and their families. It has been nominated for 13 Emmys and won 3. In 2007, he produced Autism the Musical on HBO, which also won 2 Emmy Awards. Currently, he's an executive consultant for Bunham Murray Productions. In 2012, he was inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame. I don't need to be going on and on about all of his accolades because his work speaks for himself. I'm going to show a short video first? Yes. Okay. I'm going to show a short video that was, that all the interviews were conducted by Jonathan, and the video itself was edited by one of our other board members, Andrew Egan. So thank you to our board members for their active participation.
I'm an actress.
I'm an actor.
I'm also an actor.
I'm an actor with autism.
As an actor with a disability.
I want to be able to audition for any role.
As an actor with a disability, I want to be treated just like everyone else.
If we want to be fair and let all actors play all kinds of roles, that means people with disabilities should be allowed to play the moms and the teachers and the neighbors.
People are just uncomfortable with what is not considered the norm, which is why representation matters.
Only in a couple occasions have I been cast in a character role using my prosthetics, but it had nothing to do with the role.
Just to be called in for just a role as a character who happens to be blind, but the character itself is not written as this is a blind character.
And so I've gone in for 2 roles that had nothing to do with the wheelchair.
We can do action roles. Hearing people have been doing it a lot. So why not a deaf person? To see what it would be like. Maybe people would be like, whoa, that is so cool.
I could play a lawyer, I want to be a lawyer, or if I could be someone's dad.
A mom, the love interest, the friend of the love interest, the judge. So many different roles. The possibilities are endless.
Some of the biggest roles I've had, I've literally snuck past all the gatekeepers and got in the door, and then the creative people get their hands on it and they're like, oh, wait a minute, that's pretty fun to write for.
That's my hope, that one day, they'll look at us and be like, oh, that's a normal person, she just can't see.
Support the inclusion writer today.
Respectability.
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 Hi everybody. So our panel is called Fighting Implicit Bias Through TV and Film. So how do you fight implicit bias through TV and film? For me, it's by introducing viewers to worlds and people they don't know, by focusing on love, compassion, and empathy, by celebrating differences rather than fearing them. I think all of the panelists have done this in their work, and I'm honored to be joined on this panel by Dr. Jeanette Betancourt, Crystal Renee Emery, Andrew Solomon, and Rachel Dretzen. I'll tell you more about each of them before we move to their section. For me, my fight to introduce and celebrate previously marginalized communities began with The Real World, the show I created in 1992, where the show was basically you put 7 diverse young people together to find out what happens when people stop being polite and start getting real, to quote the main title. And it was, you know, when I went off to college, I found myself with a black roommate. And I had grown up in a mostly white world. And I made some really stupid mistakes with him out of my ignorance, but I grew up a lot. And so I was thinking of that when we created the real world, and how if we put people of different geographic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, different sexual orientation, how much learning could come, and that learning would be our story arc. And I think, you know, in looking at the real world, I know for a generation of young people who are growing up gay or lesbian or transgendered, seeing images of themselves, seeing positive images of themselves on television in those formative years really changed how they felt about themselves, and it also moved the needle in terms of how their classmates felt about them. In Project Runway, we were fortunate to be able to, again, cast diversity. It was really interesting. I'm not sure why, but so many of those young designers who were in Project Runway were first-generation Americans. I don't know what it is about the immigrant experience, but it does seem to lead to, you know, a hell of an ability to produce like gorgeous, gorgeous designs on the runway. And maybe that being an outsider allows you sometimes to see things that, you know, other people who aren't privileged to be outsiders don't see. And then in Autism the Musical, again, our focus was looking at families who had felt marginalized by having a child with autism, and take a deep dive into how that affects a family. And then most recently with Born This Way, it was this wonderful opportunity to look at really this first generation of young adults who had Down syndrome, but whose parents from the very beginning like had this goal for their child to help them be the best they can be, and that meant often having them participate in mainstream schools, and also it came a time where the parents had to fight for it, but they were able to get some of the resources needed to help their child be the best they could be. And in our show, what's interesting is these young people are now 25 to 30, and the parents did such a great job raising them to be independent as they take those final steps of moving out and forming relationships away from the home. The parents are scared to death, which is a very common experience if you're a parent. It's scary to let go. One of the things I did learn on Born This Way, and it's interesting, is that when we got our first cut of the show, I realized that we had taken the easy way out in often letting the parents speak for their children. And these are, when I say children, they are their children, but they are now in their mid to late 20s and early 30s. So we went back in it on that first cut, and really wherever we could have the young person tell his own story, we did that, because we really felt it was important to let them tell their story. And yes, we wanted to hear from the parents, but we only wanted to really hear from the parents about their journey. We wanted to have our cast members be full participants in our documentary series. Which brings me to the latest project we're doing, which will air in September on A&E. It's called Deaf Out Loud. And this show is about deaf culture and about three families who are deaf, but who really show the multitude of ways that the deaf community manifests itself. It's not one approach for all in terms of how these parents are raising their deaf children in a hearing world. Some of the families are ASL only and choose not to speak even if they can. Others will speak, or if they can, and they will embrace technology, whether it's a cochlear implant or a hearing aid. And in putting together the show, again, we had to be very careful, because it's very easy as someone who has hearing privilege to, it's easy to go to the soundbite with the deaf person who also speaks. Whereas the person who uses ASL only, you know, it's like they need to have equal representation. And so it was interesting, and we showed, I'm going to show you a trailer for the show, and we actually showed it to our deaf families, and they sort of called me up on maybe my hearing privilege had not been quite fair enough to the ASL only folks, so we recut the trailer. So anyway, so you can always learn, and I think one of the things I've learned is that when I tell these kinds of stories, I need to educate myself and really listen a lot. So let's, I'm not going to push the buttons, so Lauren, are you here? If I don't push the buttons, then she's responsible if it doesn't go right. Another secret to success. Have deniability. So this is a little trailer for Deaf Out Loud that's going to appear on A&E Network in September.
Two are hearing, and 4 are adopted.
Sometimes people scream at me, hello, my name is, which drives me crazy.
Home is where an individual should be most comfortable, and ASL is the most comfortable language for us to use. When Ivy was born, we had some people say, oh no, your daughter's hearing, but you're signing?
Some people said that it's child abuse.
I had to make some tough decisions where I had to disassociate from some family members.
Okay, buddy, are you ready? Say the word baseball.
I was at the grocery store when a woman pointed to my cochlear implant. Right in front of my daughter, she asked me, what is that? What's wrong with you?
I wish that Joe didn't speak. I would rather he be deaf just like the rest of the family. What do you think?
You want to become deaf?
It doesn't look like he has a nerve on that left side.
I thought there was something wrong.
I feel so fortunate to have gotten to spend so much time with those families, and I'm looking forward to sharing this special with America. So start talking it up on social media. I'm very excited to now transition to Andrew Solomon and Rachel Dretzen. I think probably most of you know Andrew as a writer, lecturer on psychology, politics, and the arts, an activist on LGBT rights, mental health, and the arts, best-selling author, Far and Away, Stone Boat, The Noonday Demon, and Far From the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, which was a 2012 National Book Critics Award winner. And he's a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University Medical Center. And he wrote this amazing book, Far From the Tree. And then Rachel came along and said, I want to make a documentary about this. And she's an award-winning filmmaker and has produced numerous documentaries for PBS's Frontline since the mid-90s, including Growing Up Online and Digital Nation, and she's a multiple Emmy nominee and an Emmy winner. So I'm not sure where to begin. I guess I'll turn it over to you both, and maybe starting with Andrew and asking him how he got the idea to write this book, and then maybe then what Rachel was doing when she suddenly discovered it and how it was going to him and asking to make a documentary based on it.
Well, the book really began because in 1994 I was asked by my editors at the New York Times Magazine to write an article about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback. First of all, because I had no idea there was a deaf culture. I had led a very protected life. I always thought that poor deaf people, they can't hear, what can we do for them? And second of all, because I had mostly been doing foreign reporting. And Adam said, this is a piece of foreign reporting in our own country. And I went out into the deaf world, and I went to deaf clubs, and I went to deaf theater, and I became deeply involved in the deaf world. And I remember walking into a meeting at the National Association of the Deaf and thinking, I wish I were deaf. Not that I wished I couldn't hear, but I saw conversations flying off the ends of everyone's hands, and I thought it was a very beautiful culture, and in that moment I felt very marginal to it. I then found out that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, but those parents have often encouraged them to join in whatever way they can the mainstream world, and that those people then discover deaf culture in adolescence or thereafter when it comes as a great liberation to them. And I thought how similar that was to the experience of gay people who are in general born to straight parents, who try to get them to operate in what they see as the mainstream, and who eventually manage to find gay culture in adolescence or thereafter when it comes as a great liberation. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And I found her asking what had now become rather familiar questions. Do I tell her she's just like everyone else, only short? Or do I try to breathe some kind of sense of dwarf identity into her and get her to recognize herself as part of a special and select group? And as she narrated her concerns, I thought, well, here it is again, a family that perceives itself to be normal, with a child whom they perceive to be aberrant, trying to make sense of how to bring that child up, and trying to figure out what aspects of your child's difference should you be curing, what should you be celebrating. In the time I was writing at the Deaf, I had done a lot of work on the cochlear implant. I think most of you know the general arguments, so I won't rehearse them here and now. So the book really became an investigation of what I called horizontal identities. Vertical identities, I posited, are identities that are passed down generation to generation by families. Things like race, ethnicity, nationality, usually language, often religion. But you can say that some of those identities are difficult. I mean, it's still easier in the United States as it's constructed in most places to be white than to be a person of color. But no one is doing research to ensure that the next generation of children of color come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. But I said there are also what I call horizontal identities. Horizontal because they aren't passed down family trees from parent to child. There are characteristics a child has that may be different from the characteristics of that child's parent. So things like deafness and dwarfism and autism and Down syndrome and schizophrenia, things even including being a prodigy, being a criminal, being a child born in rape, or being transgender. And as I looked in all of these categories, I came to feel increasingly the difference, which seems to isolate people so much, is in fact the thing we most have in common. That everyone, even people whose children aren't as dramatically different as the ones I was looking at, has children who sometimes seem alien and foreign, and that everyone has an ongoing need to figure out how to love children who aren't what they imagined when they set out to have children. And so I feel by looking from the world of gayness and from the world of disability and from the world of these other categories that I looked at, I found a great unifying sense that our differences can in fact unite us.
I guess we're a tag team these days. So I'm Rachel Drudson, and I'm a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and have made many films over the years, some of them, quite a few of them, about families. and growing up in this country. But I'd never worked on anything about disability before. I read Andrew's book when it was shortly after it was published in 2012 and was completely transformed by the experience. Those of you who've read it will probably know what I mean. It's a really profound work of art, and I was seized with the desire to turn it into a film, in part because the stories in the book, and there are about 300 of them, are extremely cinematic in many ways, and also because it's a book about the sort of challenges and difficulties of love and about the ways in which love prevails. And I found that incredibly moving and inspiring. So I wrote to Andrew, who actually was at college with me, although we didn't really know each other. We had some mutual friends in common, and I wrote and reintroduced myself and asked him if he had thought about making the book into a film. And he responded that there were about 30 other filmmakers with the same idea. So that began our very prolonged courtship, in which I tried to woo him to choose me, and ultimately prevailed, which I'm delighted to say resulted in Far From the Tree, the documentary, which is being released theatrically by Sundance Selects, and which is in theaters right now in New York and in Los Angeles. Will be opening in theaters in Boston, Washington, Philadelphia, Chicago, and all over the country in the coming weeks, and is also available on demand. And this documentary took us about 4 years to make. Andrew's a producer on the film, as well as being in the film, because his story actually frames his book as it frames the film. And because the book took him a decade to write and had already been published for some time when I started to film the documentary, I decided almost immediately that we couldn't use the same stories that Andrew used in his book, and that we had to find new stories, because most of the people in the book had moved into a different phase of their lives by the time we were filming the documentary. So the documentary features 5 families, one dealing with a child who's autistic, another family has a son with Down syndrome, a dwarf couple trying to have a baby, and another young woman with dwarfism who's sort of finding people like herself for the first time. And then the final story in the film is the story of a family who has a son, a 16-year-old son, who murders a child. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what the film looks at. We have a trailer for the film. Is that something we want to do now, or
Sure,
wait?
sure. I think people should.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time to see it, and then you guys will have a sense of how the film works.
Lauren is going to walk over and press the button.
It's my role to get to press the button.
I'm glad I showed my trailer first, because this trailer is so great. It's like I got my Kleenex ready.
This is a call from an offender at a Louisiana Department of Corrections facility.
What, baby?
All parents deal with children who are not what they imagine. My parents really didn't want to have a gay son. I wanted to see how other families manage.
Sorry.
Good plausible deniability, Jonathan.
Xavier, do you have another?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, open it with QuickTime Player.
This is a call from an offender.
I'd just like to say that when the book came out, I did lectures everywhere and had a little video that I showed beforehand, and the only place where they couldn't get the video to play was Google.
Yeah, it's bigger than the screen. Hold on. Xavier, do you want to come up?
Yeah, that's it. If
Right,
you hit the full
but
screen.
It's a good thing you didn't push
Control
it.
F.
Xavier, just chop up, please.
There you go. I'm a Mac person.
This is a call from an offender at a Louisiana Department of Corrections facility.
What, baby?
All parents deal with children who are not what they imagine. My parents really didn't want to have a gay son. I I wanted to see how other families managed it. But I don't want to know just about families of gay people. I wanted to look as widely as I could.
By July, I knew he had autism, and I just assumed that he was impaired.
You have to sit in your chair.
It was overwhelming. I didn't want it. He was shackled on prison strike.
You know as soon as you see him, the worst has happened, and it is not going to be okay.
You go back to when they were in the cradle, and you wonder if you let them cry too long. I don't have an easy answer. A mother can't just stop loving a child. Personally, I'm very against the idea that someone is researching to find a cure for my type of dwarfism. It's the same message our whole lives. There's something wrong with you and we need to fix it. I don't think I need to be fixed. We did allergy testing.
Music therapy.
Saw a naturopath, chiropractor.
Hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Speech therapy. We thought that he should talk. We talk. So he needs to learn how to talk.
He started spelling letters with the stencils. Typed out, I'm trying, and I'm really smart. It's like I was meeting him for the first time.
In some ways, I wrote the book to forgive my parents. And in telling these stories, I was investigating the very nature of family itself.
Before we go on to our next panelist, I guess my big question is, Andrew's book was, what, 800 pages? Your film is 93 minutes. How do you do that? Is there a special sauce? Is it less is more? What is it?
Well, I mean, first of all, the film and the book are very related, but not the same. So, you know, the film doesn't try to do what the book does. The film tries to distill the very special spirit of the book and perspective of the book into an extremely different medium. And so they're companions to each other, but they're not actually the same. And I think that's something that Andrew and I discussed very early on. I felt really strongly there was no way, unless you're doing an 8-hour series, and even then, to try and do what he did. And you know, it's also interesting how sort of kind of distilled the medium, the visual medium is. And so you can say in a look, or a gaze, or a word, or an image, something that's very concentrated. It's almost like, you know, it is a special sauce. It's like the liquid that you're swimming in when you're reading a book is just a drop. With a movie, and you can kind of get so much information from that. So I do think that it surprised both of us how much of what the themes are in the book is translated into the film, even though the film is so much shorter. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Exactly.
Right?
Maybe I should have just said that.
All right, we're going to move over to our next guest, Dr. Jeanette Betancourt. She's the Senior Vice President for U.S. Social Impact at Sesame Workshop. I think I was the last generation to grow up without Sesame Street. Dr. Betancourt is a licensed bilingual speech and language pathologist and educational therapist. She also serves on a number of boards and committees that support children and families. She conceptualizes and implements Sesame's models for delivery of outreach initiatives that affect and engage children, families, caregivers, educators, particularly to meet the needs of children and adults in underserved communities. And I'm so thrilled to meet you and have you on this panel.
Thank you so much. It's truly a privilege to be here.
After that introduction, it's often people forget my name and simply say it's the Sesame Street lady. So you can always remember me as that. I say it's a privilege to be here because in a certain way we're slightly different than everyone else who's presented thus far. And that's particularly because of the audience in which we are mostly focused on, and that's very young children. Let me tell you a little bit about Sesame Workshop and particularly our work around autism and why we are here. Sesame Workshop is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to help all children around the world grow up smarter, stronger, and kinder. And the reason I bring up our mission is because we also believe that in order to accomplish that, particularly because we are focused on young children, we need the important people in children's lives, or what we often say is the circle of care, to help nourish that mission. So Jonathan mentioned our longevity of is maybe being a generation that hasn't grown up with Sesame Street. Next year, we will experience our 50th anniversary, which is rather incredible, and it's, well, thank you, but it's all because of people such as yourselves. And once again, I bring that up because now we are targeting 3 generations. So that means that within this group, there are parents who themselves grew up on Sesame Street. They are sharing it with their children. There are grandparents, as well as sharing it with their grandchildren. So what that means is that we believe very strongly in that circle of care. Part of our mission in order to do that is, most of you know us through our programming, but coupled with that from inception is the belief that we must go into communities. We must create what we call community and family engagement. And that's how the emergence of our work around Sesame Street and autism, See Amazing in All Children, came about. Approximately throughout our history of Sesame Street as well, we believe very much from day one on representation of inclusion in its widest form, whether it was different abilities, different strengths, different races, ethnicities, culture, languages, and we represented that very early on. And in fact, when we first launched in certain states, we were banned as a result of that. But in that area, we've also been very inclusive of different abilities, and always from a strength-based perspective. But over time, one of the things that we kept hearing, particularly from the autism community, was this incredible affinity between our wonderful Muppets and children on the spectrum. This connection that allowed them to have both an emotional and also a safe connection. Simultaneously, what also started to occur was this emphasis also on the numbers of children impacted. And at that time when we were first launching, and since then it's actually a higher number, it was 1 in 68 children. And as we started to do what we usually do in our research model is there a need for Sesame to play a role? Is there a role that we can play? And what we do is we go through a very intense process of finding that out. What that is we gather experts. We also go into the community and start hearing not only from those impacted by having an autistic child, and particularly a focus on young children, but also what we call the general public, those parents who have typically developing children in this age group. We also went around to what we call providers, hearing from those who service children who are autistic, and also those who service in inclusion. And where we first started, we thought, oh, we're Sesame, we may create something that may help on social emotional development or learning. What we learned was that was not the role that many wished for us to impart. Rather, what they saw for us was the role that we usually play, and that is the role of inclusion. They said to us, the one thing that we would like to see is representation of an autistic child within everyday moments, and just the emphasis that all children, what they share in common. All children want to play, all children want friends, all children engage in everyday moments. So as we did further, we discovered that our role was creating an initiative that holistically did a couple of things. It reduced the stigma around autism by simply learning to talk about what is autism from a child's perspective, but also modeling it for the grown-ups around them. More importantly, we also wanted to do it from a strength-based perspective and show, as we always do, an autistic character, a wonderful Muppet by the name of Julia, who's 4 years old, in the context of her Sesame Friends. And it was really from the autism community who drove us to say, bring her into your programming as part of what you do. What I'd like to do is show you a little segment, and now Lauren, poor Lauren, who has now, oh, I have
Lauren has been replaced.
Lauren has been replaced.
Xavier.
Thank you. A little bit of a tease.
Oh, hi there, it's me, Abby Kadabby. Did you know that I have a new friend on Sesame Street? It's true. Her name is Julia. She is sparkle-tastic. You want to meet her? You do? Okay, take a look.
Here's some more paper, guys.
Thanks, Ellie.
You're welcome.
That's just a damn one.
Nice.
Thank you.
Oh, hey, welcome to Sesame Street.
Oh, hi.
We are having some fun with finger paints.
Oh, hi guys. Hi Elmo. Hi Abby. Hi Elmo.
Hi.
Oh, who's this?
Oh, this is our friend, Julia.
Oh, hi Julia. I'm Big Bird. Nice to meet you. Oh, Julia?
Julia's just concentrating on her painting right now. You guys,
Oh.
you're all doing a great job.
Oh, Ellen. I don't think Julia likes me very much.
Oh, well, you two are just meeting for the first time.
Oh, so she's shy. Oh, I get that. I can feel shy sometimes too.
Well, with Julia, it's not just that. You see, she has autism. She likes it when people know that.
Autism? What's autism?
Well, for Julia, it means that she might not answer you right away.
Julia doesn't say that.
That's right. And she may not do what you expect, like give you a high five.
Yeah, she does things just a little differently, in a Julia sort of way.
Oh, okay.
And she's a lot of fun. Yeah. Oh, Julia likes being with a friend. Oh, and she loves to play, too. Play. You want to play now, Julia? Play. Okay, we can all play together.
Hey, that's a great idea.
Oh, me too. Can I play?
Sure, Big Bird. Okay, so what should we play?
How about tag?
I think that's a yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. But why did we do this in a context? It goes back to our mission and why you are all here. All of you have a positive approach. You all are advocates. You all believe very much in inclusion. But if you go back to where you started all of your acceptance, your way of thinking, it really starts in those early years. And our belief is that in order for there to be inclusion, in order there to be acceptance, you really start to have this in those very, very early years. Our goal And we have found this through our research, is that our entire initiative, because it's not just Julia, there's representation of many aspects of children who are autistic in our initiative, is really the focus that it has driven conversations and connections between the general community and the autistic community. I'll give you 2 examples. One was when we first started to hear in our research, and differences after showing a lot of our resources, was this particular mother who had a 4-year-old child, also a boy, who was on the spectrum, who was much more impacted. And she described that when she went into a playground, as opposed to her typically developing children, they would all suddenly come around their children, and everyone, whether strangers or friends, would accept them and would get automatically engaged in play. She said when she walked in with her son, suddenly it was like the seas parted. On a more positive note, we heard back from actually a teen girl who was autistic and saw the first episode of Meet Julia. And she wrote on social media that when she first saw this, and then subsequently also read the digital book, she said, "I'm amazing too. And for the first time, I'm seeing someone like myself when I was young." So it is the idea of how can we form through media a sense of inclusion and understanding from PERF and from all of you as being key implementers of creating that circle of care. So thank you.
Yes, I will. Thank you. I just had one question. With what we had done, we have a number of different people who might represent something. You have one character for autism. In some ways, I think that can be very challenging because, as we know, autism is a spectrum and it can represent so many. It must have been challenging, and how did you sort of end up where you ended up?
Well, it was in the context of the whole initiative. So See Amazing includes quite a bit of a spectrum of children and families, and children who are across, whether impacted more significantly or less so, male, female, different race and ethnicity. But we particularly, in looking at all of the context, we also addressed one component. Many times we're asked, why did we pick a girl as opposed to a boy, since there is much more prevalence in males? And the reason we did that was because we wanted to, again, represent the diversity, in fact, of autism. And finally, we also wanted to select, and we did quite a bit of research on that, a child who had more difficulties, let's say, in being very verbally communicating, but using other mechanisms to communicate. And that's shown throughout our program. So we did a balance.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Christo Renee Emery. She's an award-winning producer, writer, director, filmmaker, and activist. Ms. Emery, who's a friend of mine, is the executive director of You Are You, the Right to Be, an organization that fosters communication and understanding through the arts among diverse racial, social, and economic groups. Many of her initiatives flow from that basic idea. Recently, she conceived and oversaw a summit in Washington at the National Academy of Sciences to mobilize doctors, engineers, mathematicians, and scientists to develop strategies for inclusion and to inspire hundreds of young people of color to take up careers in STEM. She's also a children's author, and but what we're here to look at today is a documentary she did that's titled Black Women in Medicine, and we're actually going to play the clip first on this.
Picture in your mind an open heart surgery. Did you imagine the surgeon to be a black woman?
As a black woman, are there more challenges? Absolutely. It was just assumed that I was not the surgeon.
I would walk into a room and you would get, when is the real surgeon coming to see me?
Now, every stereotype, I was not supposed to make it.
I had never seen a doctor before I went to college. And you can't be what you can't see.
I get challenged by the system, by my colleagues, by others, in a way that a white man would not be challenged. When I'm doing something new, when I'm doing something cutting edge, there is definitely much more of a spotlight.
Some people even believe and buy into that post-racial statement. There's nothing post-racial in this country. Race matters. It's the first thing they see when people look at you.
We change history by not giving up the struggle. We still have to train another generation of young black girls. Open up these opportunities for them. Let them see the women who have accomplished so much and be inspired.
Having a diverse medical force is extremely important. To have the ability to be an example and a role model, to say this is something that I can do. Medicine is a career that I can aspire to.
As these trailblazers have shown, the young black female physicians that are emerging today can do anything they really want to do.
You know what the problem is? I'm so used to walking around, right? So I'm trying to figure out how to do me and stay put. Quite difficult. Give me a second. Let's try to stay put. All right, turn me off. Okay. Okay, you can hear me, right? Yeah. All right, thank you so much, John. I'm giving honor today to that power within me that wakes me up every morning. Some people call it divine intelligence. I call it God. And I'm just so honored to be here. I learned something 1 minute ago. So you just saw my clip for Black Women in Medicine, but the words I put in front of it for today. So the words, we are innovators, right? I felt like coming here, I didn't want to say, well, as a disabled person, or I wanted to say as an innovator. So I put that together, but I never saw it. So seeing it, I go, wow, that could have been an opening for the film. But it was really about this moment and how the word innovators turned into love. And I love what I do. And I think love transcends race and gender and physicalities. And that the more we learn to love and look at what we have in common, it'll make a much better world. The Me Too movement is sweeping across America, right? As many women, brave women, step forward from shadows of secrecy, shame to share their painful stories of sexual abuse, intimidation, and exploitation at the hands of powerful, ruthless men. Hollywood has stepped up, right, to address this inequality and abuse of power in the studio system. Yet, the disabled community within the industry are not valued for our creativity, for our intelligence, for our sensitivity, and our managerial skills. So what's going on? Fighting implicit bias through TV and film, I can speak with authority about that subject. Okay, I gotta move. Turn me on, CJ. I'm sorry. You know, I told somebody last night, lift my arm up. How do I describe myself? And I describe myself as energy in motion, right? So I just need that you move away. Kick that under the table, the car. And let's move the mic out, it bends. It can bend. Okay. Sorry. Let me get comfortable so I can do me right. What you may see before you today is a black woman in a wheelchair. Let me tell you, first and foremost, I am a filmmaker, not to mention an artist, author, wife, parent, educator, activist, and a great cook. As a filmmaker, which is my first love, I've written and produced, directed 2 feature films, documentaries, several shorts. I have worked with some of the biggest giants in the industry. People like Forrest Whitaker, Gregory Hines, Suzanne DePaz. I am not afraid to say that I'm brilliant. Yet after having made 2 documentaries, each shot in 8 different states, I simply can't get a job behind the scenes in Hollywood. And what really frustrates me to no end, and you know what guys, this ain't gonna be politically correct. When I see women with fewer credentials, far less qualifications, less experience, get hired for jobs, in the wake of the Me Too movement, that I can do in my sleep.
Yes!
Really. Who is raising the alarm for participation? I have demonstrated my capableness, but who is speaking on behalf of people like me? Because we are innovators, we are capable, but who is speaking on our behalf? I made my documentary, Black Women in Medicine, to counter implicit biases about women depicted in media. I never imagined that during the course of making that film, that I myself would experience biases about being a quadriplegic. Yet, every day I was more biases about being a quadriplegic than it was about being black. So let me explain. Filmmakers dream about getting their work approved by the Academy for consideration. That was my dream for Black Women in Medicine. There are very stringent requirements for securing Academy approval, including premiering in a New York Academy approved theater. So we found the theater, last minute, off-Broadway Academy approved, that said they were wheelchair accessible. And I was like, great, because I'm in a wheelchair, and I want the disabled community to experience a director from their community. 2 weeks beforehand, and I live in Connecticut, my co-producer went down to do a site visit, only to discover that what they said was wheelchair accessible was broken. And even if it wasn't broken, it wasn't adequate. Do you know what it felt like? This is you're at the big crossroad, and you can't even see your own film make its debut. But we got over that. During another post-screening, as the film gained traction, someone in the audience said to me, "Who directed your film for you?" I said, "What do you mean?" And she replied, "Well, we know you didn't do it." Now, even after a lifetime of experiences, of biases, based on race, now it's based on a disability. Ignorance knows no shame. No shame at all. I was completely taken back. We have to change the narrative about people with disabilities, our capabilities, our competencies, our ability to achieve and contribute. You know what I think of our community as? Grace under fire. Because every day when I go outside, I am under some sort of fire. Whether it's a sidewalk, whether it's somebody walking, flicking their cigarette at my height, hitting me and then saying, "You people get out the way." Now, if I was able-bodied, that would have been a serious ass whooping. But the best I could do was run into him with my scooter. We have to change the images that are portrayed in media, and it is up to us. We have to be part of that mainstream. We have to do that, particularly to help assist the current workforce and the workforce in the future. We have to. You know, research has documented that when it's a diverse pool of talent, that the return is bigger for that company. And why is that? Because it's different ideas, it's different perspectives. You know, you bring that difference and you make it better, not worse. Yet, that is not true about Hollywood. You know, we keep seeing the same old stories with the same old issues. And yet, you take a person like myself or like one of you, that we all have the same thing. We want love. We want to be safe. We want to have a certain standard of living. We all want that. And yet, our different spin on that story is always left out. I am a woman who is loved. You see these handsome guys with me, right? I know you noticed them. Yes. And I am a woman who loves. And yet, I never see somebody like me in the A Kiss Begins with K commercial. I'm married. I deserve a diamond. So, as a content producer, when I'm directing, I bring all those experiences to the table. I am not a brilliant filmmaker because I'm a quadriplegic. I'm a brilliant filmmaker because I'm creative and talented. And the quadriplegic aspect of my life gives me a different insight into how to live. But it does not define who I am or who I'm capable. And it should not define you either. Everyone in this room can do something more. Everyone in this room considers themselves part of the I know somebody. Each of us has a one touch where we can reach out. And all it does is take one touch. You can do a little more in helping get a young person with a disability an internship, a writing job, a producing job. Because you know, in the entertainment business, it is all about what? Who you know, and about who you don't know. So, I'm going to leave you with a story. My first feature film I worked on was called Rage in Harlem, and it was directed by Bill Duke. And Bill insisted that I come work in Cincinnati for 6 months on this film. One of the producers, production supervisor, said to me one day, you know, you're a liability on set. I was actually relegated to the production office. And I was like, do I look like a secretary? So I said something to Bill. He had me on the set. And that day had to make special accommodations. So, you know, the regular vans couldn't fit my scooter, but they, you know, Bill worked it out. So the production supervisor cornered me one day and said, you know, you're a liability on set. And I just looked at him, I said, dude, how am I a liability? A grip 20 feet in the air with a tool belt is more of a liability than me, my leg braces, and scooter. And he just looked at me and walked away. Later, one of the ADs, H.H. Cooper, overheard the conversation. He said, Crystal, I'm going to teach you stuff that you will always get a job on a film set. He taught me union. He taught me how to count film stock. He taught me all of the paperwork. And from that day on, people hired me. But the point being is, oh, I forgot, that same production supervisor, the electric team got fired at the end of the week because they destroyed somebody's chimney. So who was the liability? Or them? Point being here, we can make a difference, and we gotta change the narrative. You know, we have to change the narrative. And we can do that. We can join together. We can help each other. You know, it's not about me, it's not about Jennifer, it's not about John, it's about the collective. It's not about mental health, it's not about autism, it's not about physical challenges. We have to look at the bigger picture. Pool our resources, not just money, but our resources in human capital, who we know, and say, I need you to do this one favor. You do it, you do it, you do it. We began to build a tsunami. So, media is our way to change that narrative. And that is what I do. I believe I believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things. But since everybody in this room are extraordinary, imagine what we could do collectively. Think about that. Let's take it to the streets. Let's demand that we are seen. Jennifer and RespectAbility, I really, really thank you for this opportunity. I think everybody in this room, as you think about what you can do, think about the economic impact, because a lot of times people don't know how to do the right thing, but they know how to change when the dollar is attached. And the disability community is the largest marginalized group. And if we pull together, we do have power. So, Hollywood, get ready, because we are coming. Hollywood or bust. Namaskar.
I think Crystal points out a really good point. you know, if you're a teenager, you could turn that phone off really fast, but us older folks, it takes a while to figure out how to get that thing off. Anyway, but I was going to say that I think what she reminds us is that although we're making progress in terms of the way people with disabilities or all abilities are represented in front of the camera, with shows like Speechless and wonderful documentaries like this, and what Sesame Street is doing, behind the camera, where you have writers, editors, directors, producers, we still have a long way to go. It will, it's not a battle that's easily won. It'll have to be fought every day, and it will require everyone to do their part at trying to help people, give people a hand to take those jobs. It's so easy for people to just hire their friends and not reach out beyond their core group. And I think unless we do that, you're not going to see real change. Great, I think we are pretty much done. Jennifer, did you have a question before we move on?
We're very limited on time, but I would like each panelist to just briefly give a word of advice to the disability community. We want our voices to be heard, and we want positive role models to be on screen and behind the camera telling stories. Can each of you give us a piece of advice on what we as a disability community can do to advance an inclusion agenda?
Well, I guess we're going to go in the same order as before, so I'll jump in first. You know, when Harvey Milk was asked by a younger activist what was the best thing he could do to advance gay rights, Harvey Milk said, "Go out and tell someone." And I think there's a real need for the disability community to be visible to the able-bodied community, and the real need for members of the disability community to reach out to the other side. Some people actually are enemies and want to take services away from people who have disabilities and have all kinds of other dire purposes, many of which are being played out, unfortunately, on a larger scale in this administration than they ever have been before. But many people are just ignorant. Many people don't have contact with people with disabilities. The media representations are incredibly important, but so is the person to person. I'm a huge believer in the grassroots. And I think if you go and make yourself as visible as you can, if you go and talk to people, if you talk to strangers, if you talk to people you know, if you represent over and over again the validity and worth and integrity of your life with a difference or a disability, that will have a greater effect on public perception than all the policy papers that can be issued.
And I have to agree with Andrew. I would say that it's not unlike representation of race in the media. I personally, I've done quite a lot of work, a lot of films about African American history in the last 5 years, and my directing partner is Black, and the partnership between the two of us has been really unique and extremely fruitful, because the way we talk about it is our country's racial history is as much about being white as it is about being Black, and it's the combination that I think can produce some of the most interesting content. And I think with disability, I know that it's a highly loaded and political issue about representation on who tells these stories. And I think the more open we can be about both of us telling these stories, the more interesting the stories are going to be. I think there's a lot about this conversation between people with disabilities and people who don't have disabilities, but about perception and bias and about the way we see each other that has great potential. So I guess, I don't know if this is advice, but I think the more conversations we can have, and the more we can have them publicly, and the more we can have them in the media, the more progress we're going to make, because we're in this together.
I'll follow up on what was said beforehand, in the context that it is telling the stories and spreading that word. I do go back to why I'm here, the belief that it is also coming from those that we think least. Kids' stories and having that perception from early on of inclusion and using social media and that context along with grown-up stories and what we often say is a powerful medium of getting personalization. And more than ever in today's world, that personalization is what makes a difference in terms of media and social media in particular.
You know, my word is courage. My word is courage and determination. And Jim, are you still here? There's a guy named Jim that I met, and this other gentleman from Atlanta, this gentleman here. Courage. I need to go to LA, and right now I can't fly, right? And I am so afraid of all the horror stories, but it's courage. Like, we need courage to come out of our difficult zone and be public about it. You need courage to stand in your truth, courage and persistence. And I think that sometimes when you have a disability, that you're exhausted. You're just exhausted trying to get through the day. And you just need a little more courage and a little more perseverance. And when people around you eventually see that you're not going to give up, they join you because they see that triumph of the human spirit. And it makes it more common as specific to you being deaf or you being in a wheelchair. And so what I say is courage, and find courage in those around you. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to this panel. It's phenomenal. Thank you all so much. I'm looking for Victoria Grace, one of our National Leadership Fellows, is going to introduce the moderator for this session. I think while the new panel's coming, we're going to invite the current panel to go right in front of the podium to just take a picture if you wouldn't mind. So if Andrew and Rachel and Jonathan can take a picture while the next panel assembles, that'd be fantastic. Jonathan and Rachel, can I encourage you to come up for the photo after it's done? This is usually what we wanted. I'm just so sorry we didn't have 3 hours for that. You know, it's just everything is fantastic. Right here. So, great job. All right. I assume you're done. Yes, I am. Okay. Okay. All right, you guys, panel.
Nice trip there.
Sure. Yeah, no, come on.
No, I'm here, I'm here.
I'm here.
Oh, wait.
We're a sea of black.
No.
Yeah. Dark choices.
I'm going to go like this, okay? Can you guys see over me?
Yes.
Hey, who's taking the picture, Katie?
Coming a little closer,
All right,
so
let's look at Katie first.
I'm not stuck out here in the wheelchair.
Okay, we'll go. Oh, sorry, I moved. Yeah, I moved too quickly.
Tell us who to look at.
Look here.
Okay, good.
We've got a photo
All
bomb
right.
in the back.
Okay.
Yeah, we but that's okay. That's good.
Okay. He's from the
Sorry.
common last name in Israel.
Should I just say that?
I can just do it this way.
Can I put that
Yeah. Yeah, you just like post a picture down and it'll say save photo.
just like, I'm just gonna like put them, I'm gonna
No problem. Oh, with Andrew and Rachel.
Hey guys, we're starting.
I'm the local publicist in the studio.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. Very good.
It's at the center of the
It's a special. One time we can get more. One for now. So I have a card.
Yeah, so you're just getting the other
Yeah, I mean that's the trailer I showed today. So the trailer is being released August 16th.
If I can invite folks to please take your seats. If I can invite you to please take your seats.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's dangerous. That is dangerous. That's the way it has to be. That's very dangerous. You should put something around it. Yeah. Good idea.
Oh, good too?
Which format?
Which format? A movie player? Or, sorry, QuickTime?
If we can ask everyone to try and take their seats, please. We will be starting in one moment. First up is a video that was also shot by Jonathan Murray Shop, and I hope you enjoy it.
This one made by Cliff Pentak.
And this one was made by Cliff Pentak.
I was born with a birth defect caused out of it, but I am a congenital amputee. I use a wheelchair.
I'm legally blind.
I have traumatic brain injury. I'm dyslexic. I have a couple of disabilities.
I have autism.
I'm a rope breaker.
I'm an upper extremity double amputee, which is politically correct for, look, Mom, no hands.
So many shapes and so many different nationalities and backgrounds and demographics.
A lot of people, or a fair amount of people that have various disabilities that in school was a challenge for them.
I saw in my classroom children, students with hidden disabilities.
Only 65% of youth with disabilities graduate high school.
A lot of educators, they let them just, coast.
And as a parent, who are educators, I think it's important to challenge children and have those high expectations. Sometimes children aren't meeting their expectations, and sometimes you just have to raise them.
It's really important that people with disabilities don't fall off the cliff.
Don't mean to call it, I'm smart and capable of doing the work.
We look at immigration status, we look at gender expression, but disability is always left out of the conversation.
The disability is also like being a minority, like being Asian American. It's another battle that I have to face.
People with disabilities are problem solvers.
My autism allows me to build Legos faster than people that usually couldn't.
I'm a scuba diving instructor.
I am a rolling empire of dress management.
I finish my work on time.
I'm more than asking. It's something that will impact communities and individuals regardless of race, regardless of income.
I have been in and out of a wheelchair. There's nothing worse than coming into a room for a job that could change your life and having people go,
People are just uncomfortable with what is not considered the norm.
When you look at the issues of addiction or homelessness or criminal justice reform, there's generally a disability angle to the conversation.
Sometimes, if the police don't know that you're deaf, they'll handcuff you, and then you can't sign.
Black people with disabilities are being also harassed or killed or put in jail.
There's a difference within philanthropies in terms of their mission. Some are focused on education, some are focused on labor, some are focused on racial disparity. Disability is always left out. Disability needs to be front and center.
Respect.
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 Respectability.
Respectability.
Ability.
Respectability.
Respectability.
So now I want to hand the microphone over to Victoria Grace, who is one of our fellows in our National Leadership Program.
Hi everyone, as Lauren just said, my name is Victoria Grace Asokamsiakam, and I am a fellow in Respectability's National Leadership Program. And today I'll be introducing our moderator for our intersectionality panel, Dr. Donna R. Walton, the founder and president of Divas with Disabilities. So before she got her doctorate, Donna R. Walton was confident and hopeful with dreams of international stardom. But at 18 years old, all it took was one diagnosis to turn her life upside down. A dangerous form of bone cancer, osteogenic sarcoma, threatened Walton's life and forced the amputation of her left leg above the knee. After the crisis that took her leg, Walton became motivated to fight for the respect and dignity she believes all people deserve, especially African American women with disabilities. In 1996, Walton created her small business, LEGG Talk, to help individuals translate their personal visions into action and sustain change. In 2012, she founded the Divas with Disabilities Project, a digital campaign aimed to support women of color with disabilities. The bulk of Walton's work highlights diversity and disability awareness. Walton herself has spoken with numerous groups such as African American Women on Tour Conference and the U.S. Army. But perhaps Walton is best known for her facilitation of empowerment saloons for young girls and women of color. In these spaces, young women learn to embrace their inner strength and gain self-confidence as well as self-control over life's challenges. For Success, Walton has written, "To arrive where I am, I had to break down all the meanings my life had for me as a two-legged person and reconstruct a life for myself as an amputee one that is empowered with courage and determination." And in her book, Shattered Dreams, Broken Pieces, Walton shares her experiences over the course of several decades as she learned to rebuild her world, regain her confidence, and achieve unforeseen success. And you can find this on Amazon. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Donna R. Walton.
Thank you. All right, 2 words. Leg talk. Okay. I want to say, first of all, that I am so proud to be able to follow Ms. Emery. That was just a phenomenal speech that she gave. Her remarks were really resonating in my life. So I'm going to start off this panel with setting the tone for the topic that we have on intersectionality. And it comes from my book, which is found online and bookstores everywhere. Do not try to constrain me. Never try to fit me in a box of your own making, because I am more, so much more than you can imagine, so much more that you can force to fit a tiny space limited by your lack of vision. That poem in my new book, I thought I would share with you because it sets the tone for intersectionality. You see, when I lost my leg 42 years ago, society tried to compartmentalize me. They tried to see me only as a woman. Then they tried to see me only as a person of color, a black woman. And then they wanted to see only my disability. But when you lose a part of yourself, you do not lose your whole self. You cannot be compartmentalized. I am more than just one leg. I am a woman, and I am a woman with a disability. Standing forthright, in power, unapologetically. So when I show up authentically. In that space, consistently. What I want to share with you is that it is very difficult to walk into a room and that the first thing a person sees is my cane. They see my limp, and everything else gets erased. My whole idea about who I am is always challenged. My identities are always fragmented and marginalized. Kimberly Crenshaw actually brought the term intersectionality into the forefront 28 years ago when she coined the term intersectionality. In her paper, she says it's a way to help explain the oppression of African American women. Now today this term is used, right, in all national conversations about racial justice, identity politics, policing, and disability studies. And she confirmed, and she definitely confirmed for me, that those who live at the intersection of various identity categories in our society often get marginalized. Today's panel is going to explore the importance of intersectionality, enabling people of color and immigrants and disabilities to succeed in life. I have a distinguished panel that I'm going to allow to introduce themselves. I think people should always be able to speak for themselves. So I'm going to start with Katie Heigen on my left to introduce yourself, and then I'll move with Stephanie Farhan, and then I'll move with Clarence Page.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? My name is Katie Hagan. I'm a Respectability Fellow here on the Communications Department. I'm a native of Minnesota, although I was adopted from Vietnam. I also identify as queer, so on the LGBT identity spectrum. I am also deaf, hard of hearing. I have 2 cochlear implants that help me hear. And, well, I'm a woman, so that's pretty self-explanatory. I am at Respectability just for the summer, and I'm happy to be working with other people with disabilities, and I'm happy to be on this panel with so many great other people here too.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Hi, everyone can hear me all right? Yes, good. So my name is Stephanie Farfan. I am originally from Sunrise, Florida, and then I moved here for grad school. I am currently an intern at Win Without War. It's a progressive nonprofit in the foreign policy sphere. So that's where I come from. I'm also a little person and a Latina woman. So I have these various identities that sort of make me who I am.
You're also a good writer, by the way.
Oh, thank you, Stan. I'm also a good writer, so.
Clarence?
I'm Clarence Page, and I am a writer as well. And I'm currently a nationally syndicated columnist for the Chicago Tribune and other newspapers around the country. And being a tireless self-promoter, I appear on a number of TV programs and radio programs, because this is Washington after all, where there are more microphones than people to sit in front of them. But I'm very happy to be in front of this microphone today.
Microphone's not on, so.
Oh.
It'd be nice if the microphone's turned on as well. Let's see.
Yeah.
Testing, testing.
Now you have to start all over.
Yeah, that's okay. These are the things I do to get applause. But anyway, as I was saying, I'm Clarence Page. I'm nationally syndicated columnist with the Chicago Tribune, and I'm very happy to be here today. When it comes to identity, I've been through a number of them, and it's always been changed for me. I mean, when I was a kid, I was colored or Negro, and then by the time I got to college, we became black. And then by the time I became established in Chicago as a journalist, we became African American. That was around late 80s, some of you will recall with me. And nowadays I'm just as often categorized as a person of color. So I feel as though I've made a lot of progress.
Yeah, you have made a lot of progress.
I went from colored person to person of color. So, and on top of that, you can add ADHD. Which I didn't know I had because it wasn't invented when I was a kid, evidently. But folks just said I was nervous or agitated or hyperactive. That was a wonderful title that came along by the time I was in high school. But what was after my son was diagnosed that I began to learn more about it. And one psychiatrist said to my wife and I that this often runs in families.
So you know, Clarence, you were actually going to my next question, because I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you at what developmental stage were you diagnosed with ADHD, and what was your reaction? And do you ever recall being stigmatized after you told about your diagnosis?
I think that, well, at least if I was stigmatized, I didn't know it. Because by then I was already an established professional, which just defies the stereotype. And that makes ADD or ADHD the type of disabilities that are more invisible disabilities. And when you don't have visibility for it, then people don't understand that you have a problem, a challenge that other people may not have. And this becomes relevant in times, as I learned, when you're dealing with children especially, here in DC, for example, I found that it was easier for it was easier to get assistance under the Americans with Disabilities Act and other services in the city, because it was understood that the city's school system wasn't as developed as far as handling children with special needs as some of the suburban systems were. And we discovered firsthand that the suburban systems were somewhat overrated by their own rating system. And so it made it more of a challenge for people to get proper services in the suburbs than in the city, again, because of stereotypes. But the good thing about it was we were able to get our son into a school that was really well integrated by Washington standards, meaning you had folks from the least developed parts of the city rubbing elbows with the children of cabinet officers. And it was a real mix in that way.
So let me follow up on that then. So if your disability is invisible, you said you don't have to really sort of disclose it. So were there times when you had to disclose it?
Only when I was interviewed about it. I think because there's well, when you are dealing with a developmental problem that is not visible, then it's not easy to diagnose either. And so it takes specialists to do that. And at the same time, when you've got kids who say, you know, you've got a kid who's quite hyperactive, who disrupts the classroom, who may be more difficult to handle than others. Very often they just immediately get assigned to a group that's just isolated from everybody else and don't really get direct services that they need or attention they need, or well-meaning teachers just don't know that much about how to handle ADD kids. I told you a story about how my son was put in a seat, this is in the 5th grade, put in a seat in the back of the room that was facing away from the teacher. And the special needs counselor said that that's exactly the wrong place to put him. He needs to be up front facing the teacher. And indeed, it was much easier for him to hold his attention, and also easier for the teacher to have an interchange with him with a simple seating change.
All right, well, that's very interesting about how your disability you can sort of navigate the world without anyone even knowing about that, right? I mean, let's turn to Katie, because your disability is also invisible, if you will. Yeah. And so I want to ask you this question. How have you had to navigate the world as a deaf, queer person in your professional, academic, and personal world? And also, what are some of the challenges and triumphs you can share with us today about how you have navigated these multiple identities?
Sure. So for me, being a deaf person of color as well as somebody who is queer, I've definitely had some challenges finding jobs sometimes, and also just being able to find my social place and my place in society, really. So how I got about that, I was trying to be my best advocate and being able to tell my friends and my family when I can't hear them, because even though I have cochlear implants, it doesn't mean that I can hear real well. So I still, even if it's just at dinner with my parents, I still can't hear them across the table, even if that's 4 feet away. So I have to ask them to repeat themselves. But for me, it feels like a really big burden, and then I'm asking them to, like, a huge favor, but really it's not that big of a favor, but that's not what it feels like for me. So I've had to apply that to my college career as well, and asking my professors to wear a microphone or to repeat what they said. And so that's one way I've gone about that. In terms of my job, I've had to narrow down my search pool when it comes to jobs, because I can't be a pilot, I can't join the military, I can't do certain jobs that are heavily dependent on hearing ability. And so I have to limit myself to things that I can feasibly do unless I'm willing to fight for my right to have that job. For example, in the military, I've been told that I can't join the military, but then I've also been encouraged to look at non-combat jobs in the military as well. But it's like, do I want to put up with that fight? For example, somebody mentioned in an earlier panel that they were left behind during fire alarms, and that's happened to me too, because even though I can hear, I still don't wake up during the fire alarms because I take my cochlear implants off at night and I can't hear anything. And then we have a LED strobe light right above my bed that'll go off as well. But I sleep like a log, so that didn't wake me up. So I've been left in the building twice during fire alarms as well. So just having to say, hey, you know what, I'm deaf. If I can speak, that's great. If I, can hear sometimes, that's great, but you still need to help accommodate me and make sure that I am included in public safety trainings as well.
If your disability is invisible, how do you hold other individuals accountable to sort of integrate all of your identities? How do they get to respect the fact that you are deaf and respect the fact that you're queer? How do you sort of navigate that when you have this invisible disability?
I guess it's not a very good way for me to do it myself, but it's a good way for me to test other people's knowledge and patience, and I would not recommend doing it this way, but I will sit silently by until my friends turn on the captions, and then if they start talking about the movie at the end of it and I'm not contributing to the conversation, they'll eventually figure out that they forgot to turn the captions on, and therefore I don't know what the movie's about. Or if it's like in a conversation, I want to engage, but if I don't talk, that means I'm not getting it. So I would not recommend that you just stand by and not say anything, but that's kind of the way I'm just like, hey friends, hey family, if you don't look at me when you talk, if you don't turn the captions on, I'm not gonna be a part of your world, I'm not gonna be a part of your conversation, so do something about it, because I can't do it for the rest of my life, even though that's what the reality is, and I'm just already at 22 years old, my fuse is really short, so, I want people to learn now, sooner than later.
Thank you very much. So, Stephanie. Yes. Now, you can't walk into a room and hide behind your disability, can you?
Oh no.
So what's that like?
I very much lean into it, Ben. If for anyone who knows me, for people who were around when I was a fellow at RespectAbility, they know I'm very loud and there, and I make my presence known. As you can see, various people who were around during my fellowship are nodding their heads and laughing. Yes, I very much lean into it because, and every day I thank God or whatever higher power there is, maybe even my mother, for giving me the personality that I have, which is very combative and contrary. So whenever everyone wants to go right, I want to go left. So I'm never one to hide. So I have this disability that I can't hide, and I don't want to hide necessarily. So, you know, everything works out because of it.
So let me ask it another way as well. So studies show that many people within the Latino and other communities hide their, invisible disabilities due to negative stigma. So in light of your visible disability, let's look at it this way. What are some of the ways that you've overcome that as a little person?
So for me, well, my mother and I recently had this conversation, and I asked her yesterday, I think, can I use this conversation on this panel? And she said sure, because it's an important we had an important conversation right about this. So it was about, we were talking about how Latino families, Latinx, whatever you want to use, whatever you think is appropriate to use. Sometimes there's a stigma, not only about mental health, but around disabilities, or around even like invisible or visible disabilities. In Latin American countries, there's still this tendency to hide away a child with Down syndrome, with any sort of visible disability, any visible difference. And even when you have an invisible disability, it's never given the attention that is necessary to sort of become better. And we were talking about this because my mother is the complete opposite of this sort of stereotype or tendency of Latino families. My mother very much believed in mental health awareness. She always thought it was important for us to see a psychologist for every important development. She made me see a therapist for most of my childhood because she was worried that I would get bullied and not have any outlet for it. I was not bullied as a child. I was actually very popular, but so
okay.
Yeah, so
I think we get it. Yeah. You're a power kick, right?
So that's all I'm gonna say. But yeah, it is a very important conversation to have.
It is important. Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the educational front again and come back to you, Clarence. So we're going to think about Black students, right? We're going to think about there's 1,199,73 Black students, K through 12, with disabilities in America today. And the deck is stacked, as you know, against them. Frequently invisible, again, disabilities such as ADHD are not diagnosed with students, and they do not get the supports that they need to achieve. African American students with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by suspensions in schools, with more than 4 boys of color with disabilities and nearly 1 in 5 girls with disabilities receiving out-of-school suspensions. So on the employment front, I should say, 28.7% of African Americans with disabilities are unemployed in the United States compared to 72% of African Americans who are unemployed. So Clarence, while the statistics speak for themselves, okay, regarding unemployment for African Americans with disabilities, your bio shares that your ADHD actually helped you become employed, right? Could you elaborate more about this? And could you project, if you could project that if your disability was visible, would you have a different employment outcome?
Yeah, I want to be very careful in phrasing this so not to be misunderstood. It wasn't that my disability helped me to get employment, but my disability helped to steer me toward employment that would be accommodating for me. In other words, I'm talking about daily journalism, which is notoriously created for and aimed at people with short attention spans. It is, any of you who've ever had an experience in your lives of working for a daily newspaper or a daily broadcast news operation, know that one of the joys of it to me is that I get up in the morning, head to work, it's a clean slate, you don't know what news is going to be breaking that day unless you're awakened by it at 4 o'clock in the morning like I was once or twice. But there's a big story, you've got to go out there no matter what it is, become an instant expert at it. Gather up all the information you can and put a story together by deadline time. Once you're past the deadline, you got it turned in, you can forget about it and aim toward tomorrow and the next big story. It's great in those terms for my personality. I just found myself gravitating toward it. And it was years later when I wrote a book called Showing My Color. It was something of a professional memoir. And my son, who was then about 10 or 12, said, "By the way, Dad, have you ever read your own book?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "I mean, from like start to finish, the whole thing." He knows how I work. So actually, I hadn't thought about it until he asked, but I realized when I put the book together, I wrote it one chapter at a time. And through the whole drafting process and final draft, one chapter at a time until I had enough chapters together to have a book. But that's the way it turned out later on now when I started learning more about ADD and ADHD, that's how a lot of students with ADD are advised to approach big assignments, break them up into small pieces. Good advice for everybody, really. And that sort of thing was how I began to learn how to deal with it, and also really turn it to my advantage. Now, if I'm ever asked to go and write a book from start to finish, that will be a new challenge for me. But it's been very helpful for me, though, in terms of I've been amazed how much I can learn in a hurry. I'll never forget the day that Picasso died. I was on the city desk in Chicago, and I was asked to do a piece on what we call in Chicago the Picasso. You've seen this huge sculpture that was down by City Hall. And there's a hell of a story behind it, as it turned out. Luckily enough, it was a Sunday afternoon, but I got a hold of a couple of architects and some other people and found out, Picasso never came to Chicago. He was sent a box full of stuff from Chicago, a Cubs cap, a pizza. I don't know how well that lasted, but anyway, he created it from that. It was a fascinating story, and I amazed myself at how much I learned by the end of the day. People ask, were you an art history major or something? No, but that was the joy of the job. So there are just certain professions you can turn a disability like mine to your advantage.
Okay, thank you. So Katie, I'm going to turn back to you again. So you would probably consider yourself a high achiever, right?
Yes.
I think so. So in light of your academic pursuits, what advice would you give other people who live with multiple identities, right? Or I guess are within the multiple identity status, have a multiple identity status, and who want to be high achievers? What advice could you give them?
My advice would be to just do what you feel like you want to do and not just shut down at the feedback of other people, especially friends and family. And I think the closer they are to yourself, the more influential they are. And I have learned that you don't have to do what your family tells you to do. You don't have to do what your friends expect you to do. So what I did was I held the bar higher than how my parents and friends held it. It was way higher, and I told myself, if I reach that, that'll be an accomplishment for myself, and I'll have you know, outdone the expectations that my family and friends expected of me. And that allowed me to feel a sense of accomplishment, whereas if I had set the bar lower than how my parents or friends envisioned me accomplishing things, then I would have felt less successful. So just setting the bar at whatever level you want it to be and whatever level you know you'll feel comfortable, and be able to be proud and saying, I did that and I'm proud of myself for doing it, regardless of what your family and friends say, and just doing it no matter what the challenges are that come up. It might take years to get done, or it might just take a short time and you'll get it done eventually.
Okay, I think I use the term showing up unapologetically.
Yeah, that too.
All right, sounds good. All right, Stephanie?
Yes.
I think I want to turn to you and ask you this question about employers. I think we spoke before, and we talked about how important it is, right, when you go into a job interview and how you're perceived, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how important is it that employers work from a framework of intersectionality in order to enable Latinos, such as yourself, and a little person with disabilities to succeed?
Oh, it's so important, but you can never guarantee that an employer is going to have that mindset or is going to be able to think about creative accommodations, I should say. So you have to know your rights. So when I first moved to Washington, D.C., this was last year actually, I applied for a desk job part-time, and it was the first job I applied to in DC. It was also the first interview I got. So I was very excited. It was geared for students looking for a part-time, something that wouldn't be too labor intensive or anything that's like too intense mentally. It was literally data entry. So I applied and I went for my interview. The first half of the interview went really well. We got along really well, the interviewer and I, and she said, okay, well, I'm gonna go to my boss. So, and she's gonna finish the other half of the interview. And so, this older lady comes into the room, and she looks at me, and her eyes get really wide, and she whispers, oh, and she said, oh no. Well, you can hear the oh no coming out, but she just said oh, and so she sits down very awkwardly, and the interview goes very stiltedly, the complete opposite of what the first half of the interview was going on. And then she said, well, frankly, I don't think you're capable of doing any of the labor-intensive work. And I looked at her and I said, that wasn't anything on the application about labor-intensive work. And she said, well, you have to lift 25 pounds occasionally. And I was like, that's an accommodation. Like, I wish I had said, well, that's an accommodation. At the time, I didn't know what an accommodation is, or what would be a fair accommodation. Because we don't always know until we get that information, or that information is a we can't advocate properly for ourselves until we have that knowledge, that is to say. And so, at the time I didn't know, and I said, oh, okay, well, I can work around it. And she's like, oh, really? I was like, oh yes, I can work around it. And then she looked at my application and said, well, I don't think you're smart enough to do this. And I looked at her, and this is where my snark came out. And I said, I have a 4.7 GPA. I think I'll be fine with data entry. But, then I walked out. I did not proceed to get the job, but, I didn't want that job anymore. So,
Thank you.
You need to know so
Right.
you can advocate for yourself.
That's very important. I know that, as I mentioned, when I became an amputee, I was always advocating for myself because I sort of live in this sort of schizophrenic world. I walk out into the world and you see a leg because you see a prosthetic, but at the same time you see this cane and you see this limp, and it's like, I don't know what's going on here. And so when people try to put you in a box, they automatically assume, right? And it's interesting that I will always be relegated to not getting a job, right, as opposed to being hired for the job. I don't want to really get too much into my story, but because I do want to ask you to think about this. I want the audience to think about this and open this up for questions. So we have about 15 minutes, and we wanted to have this opportunity to ask you questions or have you ask questions of the panel. And this is the question I would like for you to think about, if you could. What are some of the ways, I guess, we can go about creating awareness and application of intersectionality in our communities, in our circles, both personally and professionally? So if the panel wants to address that first, I'd like to open it up to the audience.
People have questions?
Yes.
I didn't have a question, but I thought maybe I might try to answer.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Your question. Oh.
Thank you.
I have
Thank
two
you.
questions, actually. I have one for Katie also. I don't have to turn on the mic. I don't need a mic.
I know you do.
Yeah, you do.
I need the battery on this one just died. Need a mic? Probably not that important, but if you're saying how to have intersectionality, how to create more of it, in the world I'm in, where we educate people with intellectual disabilities how to live and work independently, I feel every time somebody with a disability goes out into the world, they're ambassadors, and they're changing the world. And I think somebody else around here said the same thing at some point, that that's your best teacher, not preaching to someone, but experiencing people with disabilities and seeing the positivity of it. And it's an experiential thing. I don't think it's an intellectual thing. And I don't think you can train them in and out of it. I think people, for instance, just being here and being exposed to this conference will walk away with a different view of people with disabilities because we experienced them personally. So I think that's the best thing. If I could promote anything, it would be continually, and I can personally do it because I'm service oriented, continually training people to go out in the world. It really is magical. I've gotten comments back from employers saying, oh my God, and I'm not talking about these brilliant autistic kids who can do all these things that other people, I'm talking about people who are taking maybe entry-level jobs and may need some accommodations. And I hear stories like, he's the best employee. I mean, he comes to the job, it's raining and it's snowing, and he's really the soul of our company, and I don't know what we would do without them. I mean, things like that. So that's opening people's eyes. And the other thing, Katie, I wanted to ask you, because in my dotage, I'm becoming hard of hearing, and I don't know how to read sign language. Did you say that when you are with your friends and they don't have on closed caption, that you keep quiet? Did you say that?
Yeah.
Why are you quiet?
I usually do that because I am tired of advocating for myself, and I've had a long stretch of it in high school, and then when I get to college, I figured, well, like, I don't know, by now I'm in a college institution, and turns out they don't, and it's actually a little bit worse than high school. So I guess I just wait for them unless I'm comfortable with talking to them. But a lot of it is that I'm uncomfortable with advocating for myself, and I'm unsure of the judgments that I'm going to receive from other people, so I would rather just stand back in the corner than say anything. Then again, it's situation dependent on who I'm with.
Katie, if you don't advocate for yourself, no one's going to do it for you. And I, who am in mostly a non-disability social world, I'm constantly telling people turn on closed caption. And they don't like to turn on closed caption because it's distracting to them. But I do it anyway. I guess it's a matter of personality, but if I could say anything to you, you've got to advocate for yourself. There's no
person that's sitting around who's gonna take up for you. Anyway, that's that.
Thank you.
My question was for Damaris. I'm also a person with ADHD, and that was something that I realized later on. I was diagnosed probably around 13.
Right.
And it was very apparent in my elementary school and middle school. I was very hyperactive all over the place, couldn't really sit down, talked a lot, and I got in trouble for it.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, yeah.
By the way, in the 9th grade, as one teacher who was the advisor to the student newspaper, I asked him if I might be a possibility that I could write for the paper. He thought I was playing one of my tricks on him again. and he made it very clear that I had no future in journalism. I always wondered what happened to him. Well, please continue.
And in order to sort of just combat that, deal with that sort of disability, I, was medicated. And I wanted to know, as a parent who has a child with ADHD, how you feel about that, how medicating a child to change their thought process to fit in with the general society.
Well, my son's more scared of drugs than I am, probably a generational difference there. But but the fact is that I think, different people have found positive effects, but do them under a psychiatrist's care, a doctor who knows what they're doing. They're not for everybody, and not every drug is for everybody either. But Concerta works well for me. I started out on Ritalin, and but at the same time, I don't want to have a habit of it, doing it all the time. But when you know that you're going to be going into a high pressure situation and all, or going to be having a big project, these can be helpful. But as my son said, they don't make you smarter, Dad. I've always remembered that. They don't make you smarter. They just make it a little bit easier for you to get over some of those humps when distractibility, one of my big problems.
Good question,
Sure.
thank you. Yes, so, a couple questions. So I want to take a mic, here?
We could probably have a whole panel about the use of chemicals or not to deal with ADHD, ADD, anxiety, depression, a whole host of chemically related issues that are perhaps silent disabilities. And I think that question probably ought to be taken up, because I think a lot of people don't seek treatment because they're afraid of that, and that does, I would say, inhibit their opportunities. And once people are in a place to be able to consider all their options, then they can make decisions about that. And it's I have actually 2 sons who both have ADHD and other issues, and deciding whether or not and when, and for them as young people to decide whether or not and when has been an ongoing conversation. And I think there's a stigma around medication that gets, in the same way that so many other disabilities that are more obvious, the stigma of medication, I think, is something that needs to be tackled in the larger discussion. That's not what I was going to talk about. What I was going to talk about was about intersectionality and inclusion. I'm here representing an organization in Jerusalem which has called Shutaf, which does what I call an inverted inclusion program, in that there are probably more young people with disabilities than people with normally developing, however you want to call that. And while it's incredibly important for those young people to have a place that's safe for them to go, what we've learned is that for the quote-unquote normally developing young people, it's even more important, because they get to understand the world in a kind of spectrum of abilities that's quite dynamic, and that they learn quite a bit more about dealing with themselves and other people than the children who have quote-unquote issues. Okay, thank you.
Hi. Katie,
ask if you've ever had a moment where you decided not to advocate for yourself, particularly with a close friend, and then later they kind of had an aha moment with something that you would think would be common sense, like putting on subtitles, if they had ever realized it after the fact.
Sure. I did have a moment like that with one of my good friends in freshman year where I have a FM system microphone that I have the professors wear and that I have on the table if we're in a small group discussion or anything of the sort. And this pen, it looks like a microphone, it's not this, but it's a microphone, but it looks like a pen. But I had a different model before, and the professor set it down on a table for a short discussion, and then my friend, as we were wrapping things up, she grabbed my FM microphone and handed it over to my professor. And at the time, I was a young mind and didn't think I could advocate for myself face to face with my friend. So I sent her a long email that could be a novel and said, I really didn't appreciate that you handed the pen over to the professor without asking my permission, because that's like, that might be like holding the door open for someone who uses a wheelchair. Some people don't like that. I didn't like that. My friend wouldn't allow me to be independent and required, assumed that I needed to be helped. So I emailed her and said, I didn't like that. And her response was, oh, I didn't think about that. I'm so sorry about that I did that. And it's like, just because I have these devices, just because I have these accommodations, it doesn't mean I need you to do everything for me, because I'm perfectly self-sufficient for the most part too. Does that answer it? Yeah. Okay.
So I want to have some final, I'm sorry, was there another question?
There's one over here, and then I will catch more in a second.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Farah. I'm with the Easter Seals Disability Staffing Network, and I'll try to be brief. Just kind of responding to what was being said about intersectionality. I thought about kind of my own experience and also interviewing for this Disability Staffing Network, me being somebody who has both physical and mental disabilities and also from a West African background. When I went to interview for my job, the Vice President of Employment Services was somebody who was very jovial, he was very cordial, he was cracking a lot of jokes, but the way that my culture is, like when we go for an interview, when you meet an elder, when you meet a job, you're very quiet, you're very respectable, and that's just the way that you show respect to your elders. You don't kind of joke back and forth. And so about halfway through my interview, I stopped and I thought to myself, if I don't joke back and kind of take the posture that he's taking, I'm not gonna get this job. And I did, and I got the job, and I've been loving it. But I've been thinking with some of our candidates who are on different aspects of the neurodivergent spectrum, if they can't pick up on those social cues, even though they have the skills to be able to do the job, they may not necessarily make that same type of impression in the interview, even though they're perfectly capable of being able to do it, just like I am. So I share this with our business developer, I share this with the people who go out into the field and who are interfacing with potential employers for our candidates who have disabilities. And so I had wanted to ask our panel if you could let an employer or a potential employer know one thing about your disability or about your identities, what would that be?
Good question. Who wants to take that one?
I can take it, actually. It's a very loaded question, but I think it's an important one. I think not only people who are applying to jobs need to be mindful of sort of reflecting the atmosphere that a potential employer or a hiring manager is giving off, but hiring managers need to do the same, particularly when you're dealing with someone who is of a different culture or of a different disability that does require that. I think there needs to be more, not sensitivity training, but sort of awareness on that, because it's on hiring managers too. It's not just on the people who are interviewing for a position. There needs to be reciprocity in that respect. Does that answer it well?
I think it does. So I'm gonna end with this, sort of the same thing supporting exactly what you just said. Through an awareness of intersectionality, we can better acknowledge and ground the differences among us. So with that, I'm gonna say thank you very much for the panel, for giving us a thoughtful discussion on this topic, and go out into the world and, blend. Show up and just blend. Make it that you don't have to compartmentalize or separate who you are. And that's for anyone. And hold people accountable. So on that note, thank you.
That was really, really, really tremendous. Thank you so much to our panel. It was really fantastic.
Yes. Good job. I have one too.
So you know what, Eleanor was coming back for her She was going to be the next speaker.
No, she actually injured herself. And she's just...
Yeah. Destiny?
Katie,
I wanted to meet you.
How are you?
Oh, thank you. Okay, nice meeting you.
We need to do something.
So I'm going to invite Joe Shapiro up. Oh, right here. The people who were on the panel just before are going to take a quick picture. So if Katie and actually the panelists, actually Clarence, if you can be in the photo. And Joe, do you mind getting in? Joe, if you don't mind.
Be in their picture?
Yeah, I want you in their picture.
Can I go in the front?
Yeah.
Oh,
Just because.
And where's Victoria Grace? Victoria Grace.
Thank you. You too.
Right. One more. 3, 2. Thank you.
Great.
All right, thank you.
So I'd like for everybody to pretend that I'm Eleanor Clift. So our fantastic board member, Eleanor Clift, was going to be doing this presentation to our wonderful next speaker. But unfortunately, she's hurt her back and has a bit of a health emergency today. And so she has sent me her notes. But I'm actually quite delighted in know that I get to give the award to Joe Shapiro because he is a personal hero of mine, and I'm just absolutely and utterly grateful for his work. But before I give the comments, I just want to give a heads up to our board members, our staff, and our fellows that after Joe Shapiro speaks, we're going to invite you to the front because we're going to ask our board members and our staff and our fellows to just say their names so that everybody who's our guest knows who they are, and we want them to introduce themselves. So on behalf of Eleanor Clift, and on behalf of Respectability, I'm going to read what Eleanor wrote for this presentation. It's my great honor to present the award for outstanding reporting on issues related to people with disabilities to Joseph Shapiro, an NPR News Investigations correspondent. His major projects include a 7-part series this year on the sexual assault epidemic no one talks about. The fact that people with intellectual disabilities are 7 times more likely to become victims. Shapiro is a diligent reporter and a fine storyteller. Listeners heard the voices of therapists and prosecutors and the victims themselves. Asked which of his works we should highlight, he cited his recent piece, Take a Number, which is about teaching parents of kids with disability to fight back. He focuses on a program called Partners in Policymaking. Founded in 1987, it teaches parents, mostly mothers of young children with disabilities, how to advocate for their child and how to work the levers of government to get what they need. The program is now in 29 states in the District of Columbia and has graduated more than 27,000 people, which is a lot until you consider that there are 5.2 million children with disabilities in America's public schools. A lot more needs to be done. Shapiro is not a newcomer to these issues. His 1994 book, No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movement, is geared to show non-disabled people that people with disabilities are more than disabled. The lead review on Amazon says, quote, "This book screams for justice and hopes for the acceptance, understanding, and integration. People with disabilities just want people to understand that they can live a life just as meaningful and worthy as the next guy." No Pity is a handbook of choice in the disability studies classes. Shapiro has been at NPR since 2001. Before that, he spent 18 years at U.S. News and World Reports, where he was senior social policy writer, served as the magazine's Rome bureau chief, White House correspondent, and congressional correspondent. According to Eleanor, she knew him from the White House when she was there also covering for Newsweek. Not that many of us in the golden age of news magazine are still out there toiling away in the vineyards of truth and producing award-winning journalism. So here's to Joe from all his friends and fans at RespectAbility, a heartfelt thank you and a big round of applause for all you've done to advance these issues in the court of public opinion. Thank you, Joe Shapiro. Somewhere here I have the award. Hold on. Okay. And so this is an American flag that was flown on top of the Capitol of the United States of America in honor of Joe Shapiro. Congratulations. Done by the United States Congress.
Wow, very
We
cool.
are very, very, very proud of you. And in case, because as we've said with others, that there are many doubters about fake news, here is a certificate that proves that this is a flag that flew in your honor on top of the U.S. Capitol. Joe Shapiro, thank you very much for all that you've done. We are really, really, really proud to have you here to accept this award.
Thank you. Wow, this is so cool. I believed you. I didn't think that. But that's terrific. Well, thank you for this recognition, and thank you. This is my. I've been making the rounds today. I just came in. I heard the last panel, which was terrific. It's particularly good to hear a new generation of advocates who are going to make this disability civil rights movement really fly and take off and expect reject stigma, expect rights, expect inclusion and integration, and will really make a difference. You know, Jennifer, you mentioned that No Pity. Actually, I did write it. I thought my audience, when I wrote it, was going to be people who didn't have disabilities, who wanted to know about the civil rights movement of other people, the civil rights movement of people with disabilities. But it turned out, actually, that didn't turn out to be the people who bought it. It was actually the disability community, or people with disabilities, people, the family members, people studying disability issues in colleges, who really made the book take off, and it's still in print. It's which is unusual for a book to have that kind of long life. So thank you for this honor. I wanted to play some clips.
Yes, please.
Well, first of all, I tell you what, you mentioned that story. The last thing I had on NPR was about this program, Partners in Policy Making, which is a great program. and I'm not gonna play a clip from that, but if you're interested, that ran on June 29th. You can Google it or go to our NPR website and find it. But the idea was it started in 1987 to train parents of children with disabilities. Parents who often felt overwhelmed. Do I need to get closer?
No, for when you want that.
Okay. We're going to do the audio. You going to do the audio, or you going to show me how to do it? Okay.
The radio people, we always need a producer.
That is my past life.
All right, so while you do that, I'm going to keep talking. So, it can be overwhelming. You're a parent, your life has changed, you have a child with a disability, you have to deal with the social service system, with the healthcare system, with the education system, and, thank you. And often it's confusing, it's exhausting, it's overwhelming. People are sometimes kind and sometimes they're rude. It's hard to do. And this program, which started in Minnesota, teaches parents how to be effective advocates. And it brings in these parents. Often, again, they don't know how to do this advocacy often, and they bring them in. They teach them over a period of months. They teach them how to read state budgets, to read documents, how to, they practice lobbying before they're state lawmakers, and they teach them, they say, go back to your communities, go back to the small towns, the big cities, wherever you are, and volunteer. Get on the special education advisory committee to your school board. Go testify before your city council. Be active, do things. It's created a grassroots movement. 27,000 of these parents, and by the way, it's not just parents, it's parents, and now a lot of people with disabilities themselves being trained. And there's a grassroots movement around the country. And in my story, I talked about one of them. Often these parents go on to other things, and one of them is now a member of the U.S. Senate, Maggie Hassan, the junior senator from New Hampshire. And she has a son with cerebral palsy. She was already a lawyer. She knew something about advocacy already, but after she took the New Hampshire version of Partners, she was going to the legislature and advocating for things and testifying, and then she was on a committee for the legislature, and she decided, I can do this. And she ran for state senator, she won. She ran for governor, she won. And then she ran for the Senate, and she won. Last week was the 28th anniversary of the ADA. I started doing this reporting when I got a call when I was working at U.S. News World Report. A press person for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society called me up and said, there's this group of Reagan appointees to a commission on disability, and they're meeting in a hotel in Washington, and they're drafting something they're calling the Americans with Disabilities Act. And she said, they're saying that disability is a civil rights issue, not a health issue. And that seemed odd and interesting, and I went. I met Justin Dard and Lex Frieden, and they were drafting that first version of the ADA, not the one that passed, the first version. And I went back to my office and I wrote a story. I learned about the disability civil rights movement. I went back to my office and I wrote a story. Actually, I listened to what they're saying and it didn't quite click. I wasn't quite sure I understood how disability was a civil rights issue. But then I went to get my cab to leave the hotel, and I got the first cab, and there's a second cab in line and a man behind me in a wheelchair. And the cab saw the guy in the wheelchair and did a U-turn and left. Didn't want to pick up the guy in the wheelchair. And I'm looking out the back of the window and it's starting to click. Oh, in Washington, we're pretty accessible. We have a good subway system. But wait, if you depend on the subway system, then it might affect where you can work, where you can live. And I started to realize how this was like other civil rights movements. John Hockenberry, the journalist, once heard me tell that story. He said, Joe, if you really got it when you story for U.S. News, which didn't run. They didn't quite believe this was a civil rights movement. It was that sort of new back then. This is 1987. But I've kept writing about this over the years. I took the year off to write my book, No Pity. And so now I went to that first meeting where they did the first version of the ADA, the one that didn't pass. Now it's been 28 years. And on the 25th, I want to play a clip from the 25th anniversary of the ADA, a story I did. And I did the story about how the ADA, how civil rights laws help all of us. We often think that civil rights laws are just for some group over there, or the group that's defined. But civil rights laws are things that create an equal, more equal society, and we can all benefit from that kind of society that thinks to make sure that people have equal opportunities, and particularly true with the ADA, because we're in an aging society. Many of the things that are helping people with disabilities are going to help people who don't have disabilities now as we age. Because what are the issues of aging after all? They're the issues of aging with a disability. So things like universal design, just the ramps to get into a building like this. When I did the story, I went to New York. I went with a lawyer who had sued the city of New York and had brought several lawsuits, accessibility lawsuits, and I had him give me a tour of his lawsuits, Sid Walensky. And so one was, we went to a subway station at the tip of Manhattan, and they sued to get a subway, an elevator to the subway platform. And I went, there was a man with me in a wheelchair, but he was the only person in a wheelchair we saw that day, right? The elevator was being used constantly. So it was people with rolling backpacks, with baby carriages, strollers, older people, or anyone who just didn't want to climb these very steep steps to the subway platform. That elevator was benefiting everyone. And I'm going to play a clip. This was at the end of my piece. I met a man named Dan Carrione, and I think this will explain his story. Dan Carrione was a police officer in New York City who'd lost his job because he'd lost his hearing, or just a little bit of his hearing. In one year, he lost a little bit of hearing, and the city decided he could no longer be a cop. Thank you, Lauren. You didn't do it right. How do you want to open this file? What do you think? Good time? All right, let's try this. Yeah. Oh, yep, that's it. Okay, there we go. Thank you. And the ADA helps people who don't see themselves as being disabled or who have minor disabilities, like Dan Carrione.
If you love being a cop in New York City is probably the best place, so I won't say probably, is the best place in the world to do it.
Carrione walks a street in lower Manhattan he used to patrol.
And to be out here in that uniform, walking among the people of the city of New York, it's a privilege.
But in a shootout, Carrione lost part of his hearing. The police department paid for his hearing aid, but then forced Carrione, the deputy inspector, to retire, saying you can't be a cop with partial hearing.
For me to embrace the term disabled was very difficult. I come from the whole warrior ethos. I take pride in keeping myself physically strong, and I didn't want to use that word. It was very difficult for me to use that word.
But Carrione sued using the ADA. He argued that with his hearing aid, he could do his job as well or better than before. In March, the city settled, and Carrione, who was just 48, recently went back to work. Now, New York will set new rules for letting police use hearing aids.
I think even when the ADA passed, everybody was thinking about the iconic person in a wheelchair.
Attorney Sid Walensky.
In fact, this is an enormous group of Americans, people who don't define themselves as disabled. The person who's in their 80s and moving really slowly and can't manage a flight of steps. doesn't think of themselves as disabled, they're just a little older. A person who can't manage a heavy suitcase when they're traveling. Those are the people who are being helped by the ADA, and it's a large and growing population.
So civil rights that sometimes is thought of as protecting some small group of people actually ends up protecting all of us. And that was the point that I tried to make in that piece for the 25th anniversary. The thing that Jennifer mentioned, the stories that I've done most recently have been these stories on sexual assault of people with intellectual disabilities. I had got data from the Justice Department that I knew they collected, but they hadn't published, and I got them to run some special tabulations that show that people with intellectual disabilities are sexually assaulted at rates 7 times that for other people without disabilities. And we know, if anything, that's actually an underestimate, because those numbers didn't count people living in group homes and institutions. But I wanted to tell this story because people with intellectual disabilities, self-advocates, have been telling me about this issue for years. They talked about how they're not expected to have romance or sex, and they don't get sex education, and they're not respected, and also how they are very vulnerable to sexual assault. So it was people with intellectual disabilities who told me this. Let's see, so I wanted to get their voices in the piece, and so this is a clip. Oh, the last piece I did, by the way. I might need.
We are taught
this is
to
it.
trust grown-ups more than anyone else would be, because when you have a disability, people are always telling you, do as that person says, do as this person says, and all this other stuff.
That's Thomas Mangrum. He says he was a young boy when he was assaulted by a deacon at his church. He told his parents, but they never said anything about it to him again. Mangrum says people with intellectual disabilities just aren't believed.
They think if you got a disability, that means you lie. That you can't really tell the truth, or you don't know what the truth is.
People with intellectual disabilities often do have trouble speaking or describing things in detail or in proper time sequence. Our investigation found that makes it harder for police to investigate and for prosecutors to win these cases in court. But when sexual assaults go unpunished, then perpetrators are free to abuse someone again. It's one reason the NPR numbers show the rate of assault for this population is so high. Thomas Mangrum, who lives in Washington, D.C., thinks it's a matter of bias.
And a lot of us in the disability community, people don't really see us. People don't see us at all. They just see our disability, and that's it.
And yes, sometimes the sexual assault of people with intellectual disabilities does get discounted. In 2014, a judge in Georgia threw out a conviction. He said the woman with Down syndrome didn't behave like a victim. She'd waited a day to report the assault. And in 2012, a psychologist testifying in Los Angeles said a 9-year-old girl who'd been assaulted by a boy at school was likely protected against emotional trauma because of her low IQ. The jury was so offended, it awarded the girl $1.4 million in damages, far more than the family was even seeking. That kind of thinking, that people with intellectual disabilities suffer less, gets Carolyn Morgan of Philadelphia angry. She says, we feel the same pain as everyone else.
We do feel pain all the time. Don't tell me that it'll go away.
She knows she's dealt with the pain of her own rape. And she says anyone who denies her pain is ignorant.
They can't see that. They don't want to see it. They close their eyes to it, close their mind to it.
You know, I had lots of people in my stories, lots of women and men, but the only time that anyone started to cry was that one time when in my piece that I used anyone crying was Thomas Mangrum, and the thing that made him cry was the idea that there was bias, that people did not take him seriously. This is a common thing in the lives of people with disabilities, that they get discounted. you know, and you've heard some of those stories today about being discounted in general, whether it's going to a job interview or something else. So one thing that we found was that people with intellectual disabilities often don't get sex education. It's just assumed they're not going to be in a relationship, they're not going to need to know this stuff. And of course they want to be in relationships, and they want romance, and they want to know what about healthy relationships. So I wanted to put that part of my story too. And I ended up going to a class in Maine for people with intellectual disabilities where they were taught about healthy relationships. And I recorded that, and they were spending this whole time talking about how they wanted this respect. They wanted people to know, yes, we want relationships like anyone else. We want the same opportunities as everyone else. We want to be taken seriously. We want to be respected. And so there were people with all variations of intellectual disabilities. And this class, by the way, went on for about 3 hours, and everybody was way into it. And 3 hours, and people were participating, and there were just a couple points where they took some breaks, including once where they got up to dance, and I'm going to play that part.
So let's try it where I start it and then you guys follow, right? My body is my own.
My body is my own.
And I get to decide what is right for me.
I get to decide what's right for me.
The material in this sex ed class is not watered down for these people with intellectual disabilities. They take on complex issues like breaking up and abusive relationships. The main accommodation is that the material is broken down and spread out over 10 sessions, and each class lasts for 2.5 hours. The people here are completely attentive. They do take a couple very short breaks to get up and move around.
Okay, I'm gonna start the music.
And at one point, they take a break and get up and dance. Everyone in this room says they want love and relationships. They see their parents, their siblings, their friends in relationships. They see it when they watch TV and go to the movies. They want the same things as anyone else. But the men and women in this room know that in the eyes of the rest of the world, they're not seen as people who are going to find love, romance, or sex. They're considered childlike or incapable or just uninteresting. When they were in school, they probably didn't get the sex ed classes the other kids got. And now that they're adults, it's harder for them compared to other people to develop relationships. Just going on a date is hard. They probably don't drive or have cars. They rely on public transportation. They don't have a lot of money. They live at home with their parents or in a group home where there's not a lot of privacy. And then there's that history of sexual assault, the thing that really complicates relationships for people with intellectual disabilities. They suffer some of the highest rates of sexual abuse. Our NPR investigation used unpublished federal crime data and found people with intellectual disabilities are sexually assaulted at rates at least 7 times the rate for people without disabilities.
Oftentimes it actually is among the only sexual experience they've had.
That's Kitty Park, who teaches the class.
When you don't have other healthy sexual experiences, how do you sort through that?
And that's why Park brought the sex ed curriculum. Because the best way to stop sexual abuse is to give these men and women the ability to identify what's abuse and then how to stop it.
And then it's breaking the chain, being empowered to say, no, this stops with me.
So let's try it where I start it and then you guys.
Okay. So that, by the way, that is a great radio moment. That's why I love, that's why what I love about radio and leaving print, the idea that I went there and here they're talking about they want respect and they take a break and they get up and dance to Aretha Franklin singing Respect. It was just great on radio. And if you went to my story online, you wouldn't hear or see, you wouldn't get any of that. But on radio you can convey that. All right, so if we have time, I'll take a few questions. Jennifer asked me what I would say to younger people who are interested in getting in the media.
Who would like to be journalists, what's your career advice?
Yes.
And then for the disability activist who wants to pitch a story, how do they pitch a story that would be heard?
Okay. Jobs, internships are important. And we don't have a lot of internships for younger people with disabilities. There are some, I think NBC, right? NBC has a Tony Coelho, or there's a number of things that NBC's offering. NPR, we have a great internship program. We don't do anything specifically for someone with a disability. Maybe we need to talk to you about, like, you know, having you sponsor one, and we're back and forth about whether we want to just hire our own or whether we let somebody from outside do it. We've started to do that. It's not easy, but getting the experience is important. It's hard. I was reading a story at the beginning of the summer about a woman at Georgetown who uses a wheelchair, and she had a good offer of an internship, but if she took the internship, she'd make too much money, she'd lose her Medicaid, she'd lose the aids. I mean, so it's much more complicated often in the lives of people with disabilities to get those internships. So anyway, just a lot of media organizations have internships apply, and it's the same as what you do for any other job about whether you know, what accommodations that the employer would make, whether you want to talk about your disability, if it's a hidden disability. It's all those same calculations. The other issue as far as pitching stories, journalists, we are so, I get hundreds of emails a day. And I will try to respond to something that's personal if you tell me a story. I can't always. You know, newsrooms are just, our numbers have been cut. You know, we don't sit in big offices with, you know, with assistants. We're doing it ourselves. If you catch me on a day when I'm not busy, I might have a chance to write you back a thoughtful email. If I'm on a deadline, then I may not see the email for a few days. If you have a good idea, we like good ideas, and we like to tell stories. I like to tell stories. So if there's a personal aspect to it, it helps me. Instead of just saying, you should do a story about how hard it is to get a summer internship if you have a disability. It would help if you told me the story of how you tried to get a summer internship and the offensive thing that the recruiter said. You know, like we heard at the last panel, not Katie, Stephanie talked about, right, the person who she had applied to, and found excuses not to give it to her. You know, something like that would grab me more than just suggesting a topic. And by the way, just because you don't hear back or the journalist says, no, I'm not interested now, don't take that too personally. It may be that I am off on some other story and I don't have time to do that story, but maybe if you get me on the right day, maybe it is a story that I'm interested in. The woman who called me to tell me to go watch the group that was coming up with the ADA, I didn't have anything to do that day, and it sounded interesting, so I went. But if I'd been on a deadline, I had another story, I wouldn't be here today. I don't know what I'd be covering. You know, that got me into writing about disability. Do we have time to take a few questions?
We have time to take one question. Is there anybody who has a burning question?
Hey, Jesse Freiberg, National Organization on Disability. So, No Pity is required reading at NOD.
Oh, good.
But I'm curious, you know, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how you thought this was a book for the general public, and it really has become, you know, testament in the disability community. And I'm curious, having spent so much time thinking about and researching and spending time with the disability community, why you think in the midst of that movement and the ADA being passed, that the book didn't resonate more broadly? And what's it going to take to get these ideas into the mainstream and to make them resonate as a journalist and again, having spent so much time with this community? What's it going to take?
I don't really understand. When I wrote the book and I had success with it, I figured lots of, every news organization would want someone covering disability. I've gotten so many good stories by looking at just issues that everyone else covers, but looking at it from a disability perspective. I spent a year in 2005 following people back from Iraq and Afghanistan, dealing with the injuries of war, the psychological injuries, the physical injuries, and having an understanding of disability just informed my reporting so much more and made it better. I spent time then writing about aging issues. I understood aging in a different way than other reporters do. So I'm a little puzzled that more people haven't taken that path. So what's it going to take? I think it's, and when I talk about 1987, I'm sure a lot of people that's in this room, that's ancient history. Things are changing. So I think it's going to be a new generation of writers and citizens. The time between, people with disabilities were the last people in this country to be guaranteed a right to education. 1975. The special education law passed. So you had a whole generation that didn't get education at all, and then when they got it, they didn't get great education. They were excluded. There's almost the same amount of time between Brown versus the Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act as there is between the 1975 education for the what was it? Before it was IDEA, it was education for handicapped children. What was it called? Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So it's about the same amount of time between Brown and the Civil Rights Act as there is between the first special education, that first guarantee to right to education to the ADA. So there's so as people get more opportunities, better education, as their families see that, then attitudes in society start to change. So I think it's happening. I'm surprised that it hasn't happened more quickly. I think that there's still, as Thomas Mangrum said in that clip, there's still a lot of prejudice and bias against people with disabilities. We tend not to see people with disabilities as equal and deserving to the same things as everyone else. So a new generation of younger people with disabilities, as they have more opportunities, better education, they still have to break some of these barriers. There are not a lot of journalists with disabilities, so that's a barrier a ceiling yet to be that you will keep breaking. It's going to change.
Let me just say that Joe Shapiro is like a journalist, and when Eleanor was very sorry that she could not be here today, and I will also say, and she sends her love and best, and I will also say that Judy Woodruff also sends her love and best because she was here, earlier, and Joe Shapiro, you are the quintessential journalist for every issue, but especially for our community. Thank you for your unbelievable contribution to our safety, our security, our better health, our employment, and our better future. So thank you very much. So I'm going to actually ask all of our National Leadership Fellows to come forward, and our staff and our board members, because we are a volunteer-led organization in many ways. Many people don't realize we actually only have 5 people on paid staff at RespectAbility. So we have twice as many young leadership fellows at least at any given moment than we have paid permanent staff. So we run by young talent. So if I can invite Ben Spangenberg, who's the head of our National Leadership Program, to introduce himself, and then the fellows are going to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Ben Spank. Is this mic on? Hi, my name is Ben Spangenberg. I'm the National Leadership Program Director for RespectAbility, and I am really excited about all 11 of our fellows this semester, this summer cohort, and My job is to recruit and to mentor and to train 36 at minimum young fellows a year. We have 3 cohorts, including the summer cohort. So I want to introduce to everybody our summer cohort, starting with Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel Wallaga. I go to Washington College, which is in Chestertown, Maryland. I am a part of the development department, and currently I'm working on the Inclusion and Philanthropy Survey Report project. And I hope that you will join us in achieving inclusion of disability and philanthropy. Espero que participarás en la inclusión de discapacidad en filantropía. Únete con nosotros.
Hi, my name is Victoria Grace Asokan-Siakam, and I attend Washington University in St. Louis, where I'm studying International Area Studies Development. And I'm also part of the development team with Rachel. And I'm also working on the Inclusive Philanthropy Project, working with infrastructure organizations and other nonprofits on how they can make their organization, their website, their resources more accessible to people with disabilities. Thank you.
My name is Manela Ipari-Gire. I'm a rising senior at Rutgers University, where I'm studying political science and international studies. I'm a policy fellow at RespectAbility, and I'm working on a Spanish resource guide as well as other policy research.
Hi, my name is Christina Revilla. I am a rising senior at the Catholic University of America, right over here in DC. I'm a politics major, psychology minor. I'm also on the policy team at RespectAbility, and along with policy research, I also am working on the Spanish toolkit, which will be a resource guide for families and parents and students with disabilities that, along with the intersectionality theme, that our English language learners are English as a second language. So please join us, por favor, únete con nosotros.
Hi guys, my name is Thomas Snow, and I go to Thomas Wood Ness High School as a rising senior. As an entrepreneur, I want to study marketing and film when I go to college. And right now I'm in communication intern, and I am in charge of any IT work, such as Facebook Live we're doing right now and web development. Thank you.
Hi again. I was just on a panel half an hour ago. I'm Katie Hagan. I'm on the communications team. I'm a senior at the University of Minnesota, majoring in psychology and pre-law as well. At RespectAbility, I do work with the Hollywood Disability Inclusion Project to ensure that actors and actresses at production agencies are properly representing people with disabilities behind and in front of the camera as well.
Hi, my name is Danielle Kowecki. I'm a rising senior, and I attend Mercyhurst University. I am a communications intern, and I am working on profiles, and I'm also working on contact lists.
You're blocking the cart. Right here.
Hi everyone. My name is Daniela. I'm a rising senior at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I am a policy intern here at RespectAbility, and this summer I am also working on a Spanish resource guide and on press releases.
Hi everyone, I'm Molly Donald. I'm a student at the University of Maryland, and I'm also part of the policy team here at RespectAbility. And this summer, I've spent my time taking regulatory information, statistics, and legal language, and just making it slightly easier to understand, more comprehensible, and user-friendly.
Hi, my name is Xavier Taylor. I'm a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
and I work in the communication department of Respectability. I spend most of my time editing existing content, or creating content and editing existing content to make it more accessible. We hope that you will volunteer with us in our next cohort for Respectability. And we hope that you will volunteer with Respectability, or that you will apply for our fellowship program, especially if you're beginning your journey into the workforce. By joining Respectability, together we can improve the lives of people with disabilities by fighting stigmas and advancing opportunities.
Thanks. If I can now invite our board members to come up. Was it board next or staff? I think it's board. We're just inviting people to come up if you're on our board of directors or advisors, to come up and introduce yourselves briefly, because we want everybody to know who is behind our organization. All of our board members are volunteers, myself included, and so let me just pass the mic. And I'm blocking carts, so I'm going to move over here. I want the captions to be seen, so maybe we can come along over here.
Good afternoon. I'm Vivian Bass, and I'm pleased and proud to serve on the Executive Committee of the Board of Respectability. Been engaged with Respectability since really it was just a vision and a dream, and it's become a really huge part of my life and something I treasure very dearly. I've lifelong work in field of disabilities, developmental disabilities, and others, serving as CEO here in the area of JFGH, supporting individuals in 77 locations, as well as innovative transition programs, and additionally now am the international chair of an organization working on behalf of violence against women. And I feel blessed to be in the DC area, actually close by the office, so I can be boots on the ground and have the opportunity to really get to know our marvelous staff and interact with our fellows on a pretty regular basis. And really good. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Vivian. Delbert, come on up. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Delbert Wetter, and I am a member of the board here at Respectability. It's my honor to be working with Jennifer and this entire group for the past 2 years. I am the CEO of Exodus Film Group, and I'm responsible for the business and financial and legal areas of the production and animated films. We do live action and documentary films at Exodus. That's my home here. I graduated from Gallaudet University, right down the block. I graduated from George Washington Law School here in DC as well, so I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. Heidi?
Hi everyone, I'm Heidi Kreiser-Daroff. I'm also very honored to serve on the board of Respectability. I'm also local, and I work with the Israel Forever Foundation and several other nonprofits in the area, including Sunflower Bakery. So I hope you enjoyed all their treats today. And it's really, as a parent of a child with disability, it's incredible to see everyone that was in the room today, and to see how committed everybody is to making society more inclusive and to making the future better for everybody. So thank you.
Judah?
Hi, I'm Judy Creed. I'm from Philadelphia, and I think I was one of the first group of board members here. I thought I was doing Jennifer a favor because she asked me to do her a favor. Turns out you did me a favor for being here. This has been a really wonderful personal experience. I'm the board chair of a group called J-High in Philadelphia, where we teach people to live and work independently. It's a successful organization. But Jennifer and this whole group of Respectability has taught me, and therefore I could teach our organization, so much about people with disabilities, even though I have my own child with a disability. But Jennifer has like a 30,000-mile view up and down onto everything, which is great vision, and it's just benefited me so much. Thank you, Jennifer, for this opportunity.
Our co-founder of Respectability is Shelley Cohen from New York City.
Hi, I'm Shelley Cohen, and
Jennifer and I in the back of a bus, visiting camps that were inclusive of people with disabilities and were self-contained camps, came up with kind of this idea. And Jennifer is a force of nature, as most of you by now all know. And she created this incredible organization that I truly believe is really helping to change things for people with disabilities and give people with disabilities better, more inclusive lives and bettering society in general. Our kudos to Jennifer for this extraordinary conference today. It was really enlightening, and I think those of us who were here the whole day really gained a tremendous amount, and thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Shelley. And as Linda's coming up, she also heads the Jewish Inclusion Project, which is an extraordinary tour de force in New York. Shelley does. But Linda, let me introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Linda Berger, and I'm very happy to be on the board of Respectability as well, and to do anything that Jennifer asked me to do. I am, in my day job, the CEO of Jewish Family Service in Houston, and in this world, I feel like I'm representing the Third Coast, because there are people in the middle of the country and in the South who also care about these issues. So I always feel like that's my voice, and that I want to be sure that we don't forget about people in the middle of the country.
Thank you, Linda. Linda's also an expert on mental health issues and is doing tremendous work on that. Dana?
Hi, everybody. My name is Dana Marlowe, and again, I also want to echo everybody's accolades and gratitude for everyone for being here, to Jennifer, to the entire staff, and the board and the fellows for doing such an incredible job today. So thank you. Monday through Friday, I wear a hat running an IT consulting firm called Accessibility Partners, where 85% of our employees are people with disabilities, working with Fortune 500 corporations and the federal government to make technology accessible for everybody. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Dana. John?
Hi, I'm John Murray. Had the pleasure of moderating a panel earlier. You know, I think that an organization like Respectability really is essential. We've seen what GLAAD was able to do for LGBT rights and inclusion, and I think we need a really strong organization to do the same thing for people with disabilities, and I think Respectability is that organization. So I'm very honored to be a part of it.
Thank you, John. Gabby?
Hi everyone, I'm Gabby Anstenson, and I've had the honor of being on the board for about a year.
Thank you. And Gabby is in New York, and we're working on a very exciting project in New York. If anybody knows women in particularly with disabilities, we are working to recruit, train, and help place 50 women leaders with disabilities or lived disability experience in New York City to be on the boards and to be active in nonprofits in New York City, so that our voice is really heard in that city, and Gabby is really playing a vital role in that. Dee, come on up.
Hi, and I am again also very, very happy to be here and to be with people that really care about other people. And in my work, I advise people that are highly successful but don't always care about other people the way they should. So this is tremendous, and thank you very much. And I also want to do a special shout out or thanks to my friend Chris, who flew from Atlanta to New York to meet me in Connecticut to make it a little bit easier for me to go on the Excella this morning and get up here. So Chris, thank you. And things like that, I heard not all of the meeting today, but I heard some of it, and I can hear a lot of people talking about the things that people do, the little small things that help, that you know, to help, you know, people in wheelchairs, you know, like step out of the way or make it a little bit easier or open a door for them or something. And that's something that, you know, I think we should all do. And so that's, again, thank you. Sorry it took more time, but that's
Thank you, Dee.
Okay.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. So my name is Donna Walton, and I have the pleasure of meeting, I guess, Jennifer identified me, and that's an honor. She plucked me out from on the web, I guess, and she identified the work that I was doing around women of color with disabilities, and she became very passionate about my organization, and so brought me on to be a board advisor, and I hope that I can be impactful to the work that you're doing in terms of women of color being very inclusive in, you know, the disability workforce and the disability in Hollywood, and yeah.
You're awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrew Egan. I'm a creative director and I have an agency in New York. And I'm very proud to be working with you on board. And I hope I bring a point of view that's maybe different to everybody else and able to contribute something to that. So thank you for having me.
And I just remind everyone that all those fabulous black and white shots that you saw, the public service ads, including our logo and our pins and our programs, were all done by Andrew, who gave us a very professional look. And I think that's very important because when people don't respect people with disabilities, frequently the brand of disability organizations just looks a little, frankly, not as modern and not as professional as other organizations for other issues. And he represents, as a brand and advertising executive, some of the top brands in the world. And the fact that he was willing to do this for us, I think, really upped our game. I hope everybody enjoyed the PSAs. We certainly appreciate everything that you're doing for us. And Cool Gray 7, his firm, is really helping. I'm very proud of our staff. And I just want to say that this is an incredible group of people. They do the work. We always call ourselves the tiny but mighty army. It's a very small number of people on professional staff, but they're extraordinary people. So they're going to come up and introduce themselves. So starting with Franklin.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everybody. I really want to sincerely thank everyone for coming on behalf of the whole staff. My name's Franklin Anderson. I'm the manager of Inclusive Philanthropy and Development. Basically, that means I don't have much spare time. I wear two hats. I have program responsibilities. I help promote our work in promoting inclusive philanthropy and an inclusive nonprofit sector for people with disabilities. You know, we feel it's important to, as a 501c3, to kind of start in our own backyard and advance inclusion in that way. And I also do traditional development work as well for the organization. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Jones, but I also go by Beppy. That is my nickname. I am the manager of partnerships. Probably like 50% of you at some point got an email from me, so it's really nice to meet you all and put faces to your names. I am Jennifer's day-to-day executive support. I ensure that the office is running smoothly, and also I make sure that everybody has everything they need to work successfully. I also help a little bit with development by reaching out to foundations and other activists. And I'm also one of the staff point people for the Spanish language toolkit that we will be creating.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone, and congratulations to the diehards who are still here. We appreciate you. We love you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us. My name is Philip Kahn-Polly. I am the Policy and Practices Director for RespectAbility. I've been in that role for 3 years, and it's been a pleasure to see the workforce transform, to see the workforce boards really take this issue on, to see thousands of people with disabilities into the workplace for the first time. And really, the world is coming together. Yes, there are very significant political challenges in the district, but there are leaders across the country. There are leaders not in the political system in Hollywood and in the private sector who are really stepping forward to really embrace the 1 in 5 Americans who have disabilities. And I'm humbled to play my small part in it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tanya Koslow. I'm the Director of Administration and Finance, and I've worked with Jennifer over 20 years and have enjoyed every minute of it. And I just want to thank you all for coming.
Hi, I'm Lauren Ackerman.
Mom, thank you all for being here. Most of you that are still here have been here all day. And I am the communications director, so I have received many emails from many of you, and I also lead our Hollywood inclusion outreach and some of our political outreach work.
Hi, I'm Debbie Fink. I'm the Director of Community Outreach and Impact. And as part of that, I'm very heavily involved in recruiting and volunteer corps that we'd like to see nationwide. So we want you, yes we do. So for those of you who are here, please check out our website, www.respectability.org, or email me directly, debbieF@respectability.org, and we'd love to get you involved in one of our many volunteer core teams. For example, jobs, education, Spanish, resources, fighting stigmas. There's something for you to do, and we would love to hear from you, because as Helen Keller said, and Crystal put in her own words, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. So please join us so that we can really do so much. And if anyone wants to take food home and an extra lunch for tonight or tomorrow, please, we will send you home with a goodie bag.
So we have food and networking, because we're very big on networking, because moving and advancing agendas really takes a lot of people working together. I'm very pleased that we also have some alumni of our National Leadership Program here. It's really wonderful, and I'm looking around and seeing some of our former fellows, and it's just been fantastic to have them and so many leaders from so many groups with us. I also want to thank the Kennedy Center for helping us connect to Carla's eBay, who did the wonderful singing for us. The Kennedy Center has a really wonderful inclusion program. Oh, Ben, he introduced himself first, but with the fellows. But he's standing with me because Ben is my guy, and we always work together. Ben was like one of the originals when we had nobody on staff. But we're an expanding organization. None of the work that we do would be possible if it wasn't for some generous support from organizations like the Ford Foundation and California Wellness, California Endowment, the Weingart Foundation, the Weinberg Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and I want to thank our newest donor, if I can say, the Coca-Cola Company has joined us today as a donor to Respectability. Thank you very much. We are a growing organization with big goals. This year, as you heard on one of the early panels, we had a four-fold increase in the number of new jobs for people with disabilities this year. Four-fold, from 87,000 new jobs to 343,000 new jobs. This happens partially because of a robust economy, partially because new technology is enabling people with physical impairments in particular to have more access to the workforce, partially because of the great work of many who fought for the ADA, which Joe Shapiro covered and talked about, and which was co-authored by one of our board members, Steve Bartlett, who couldn't be here today, but one of our vice chairmen is literally the Republican co-author of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But a lot of it is really the theory of change. Here at Respectability, we're really obsessed with looking at data, looking at best practices. Many people in the disability community were doing things were absolutely core and necessary things to advance opportunities for people with disabilities, but though they were necessary, they were not always sufficient. What we're trying to accomplish as an organization is to try and advertise the best practices around education and employment for people with disabilities so they can be replicated across the country. Today in America, only 1 out of 3 Americans with a disability who's working age has a job. But in fact, it's very uneven. While the top line has stayed the same until this year for decades, underneath the top line there's a very different story. Some states, only 1 in 4 people with a disability has a job. In other states, it's 1 in 2. So what are they doing right in the states that have a far, far greater likelihood of employment for people with disabilities than in other states? And how can we bring those best practices to the places that are not currently using them? The Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act brings new legislation that really passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Literally, in a time of fractious partisan bickering, only 4 people voted against it. Only 4 people voted against it. So this is a consensus issue. And what it has done is it has mandated that the entire workforce system, which is a $17 billion a year system to enable people with barriers to work to get into the workforce, that it needs to be accessible to people with disabilities so that we too can have access to the workforce. So what we're, with our tiny and mighty team of staff in this great group of fellows and this great set of boards, is to try and replicate the best practices and get that workforce system and the private sector companies to be using the best practices, because when we see star companies like JP Morgan Chase and like Coca-Cola using them, we see that those companies actually make more money for stockholders, for shareholders, because the value that people with disabilities bring to the team in terms of their innovation and their loyalty and the real talent and energy that they bring to these diverse work teams. As we move ahead, we need more support from volunteers and from others, and we've been really blessed today to see people from a very broad array of identities, demographics, political views. Really, you couldn't have more different political views than the 2 people who spoke together at lunch. On many issues, they could not be more diverse, but on these issues, they share some core commitments to advancing progress. And so everybody in this room, we appreciate you so greatly. We really, really are so grateful to our board and our staff and our national leadership fellows and our supporters, to Congressman Brad Sherman, who got us this room and spoke so beautifully today. I will also like to say the speakers were just extraordinary. And Crystal gets a gazillion offers to speak or invitations to speak. For her to come down and for Vincenzo to be here to speak from Atlanta, the people who traveled in from out of town, we could not be more grateful. So thank you very, very much. I just want to say that we have food, and I love food because it's a good excuse for networking. We have this room until 5:30 when the U.S. House of Representatives will tell us it's time to go. And so I hope that you will take the time to meet the speakers and the Respectability team, and that we will get to meet every single person that is here. And I just want to give a special thanks to Lauren Applebaum, who's here somewhere, and to Debbie Fink, and to Beppy, who really, tour de force on putting this particular program together. Every person on our team was a part of this, but the 3 of them, they're up all night working on worrying the details. And so I want to thank you. Last year we did this conference, we had half as many people. We were in a room half the size. We really like this room because it has the TV screens, but next year we want to see every single seat taken, so please help spread the word. The conference tape will be on our Facebook site, so I hope that when you go back to your computers that you will share the videos that will be on Facebook, because the speakers that we heard today I really feel were really extraordinary and they deserve to be heard. And I just want to say that I want to give a shout out to our intersectionality panel, that I myself am on a deep journey on some racial justice issues. It's something that our organization takes incredibly, incredibly seriously. I'm a person, obviously, as you can see if you are sighted, I'm a person with white privilege, but intersectionality and understanding racial justice issues and every sort of oppressed or minority group that needs to have a hand up, we want to be a part of that agenda, and that includes our work with GLAAD in the LGBTQ space and our work with the Muslim community in Hollywood that is very important from the respectability perspective. that America be a place of opportunity for everyone, and we know that right now that is an aspirational goal and not yet achieved, and it is one of our core functions as a group that we're trying to fight for everyone who wants to move forward to be welcomed, included, and appreciated in our society. And I also just want to say that's whether you're a citizen or not. There are people who are undocumented who want to be a part of making this country a better place too, and we have to respect that there are people who bring talents that are extraordinary, that are now untapped, and it's very important to bring those talents and those assets, because our economy will be better, our country will be stronger, we will be safer when all of us, regardless of our ability or any other identities that we carry, can bring our whole and best selves forward. So on behalf of our board, staff, and team, thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our ASL team and our captionists for doing extraordinary work. You did it. Right? Yeah. Oh, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. I'm so glad that you are here. Oh, good. I'm really glad you came. And where are you located? Okay. I've been in Indianapolis for 10 years. Yes.
Hi, how you doing? Good to meet you. Yeah, so I'm the Fellows Director. So my job is to recruit them, to make sure that they have all the accommodations that they need, that they have a really good learning opportunity while they're here. So some of the things that I've always instituted is making sure that they have at least one speaker come in every week. And we also have them go off-site to different events around the DC area to make sure that they're getting good networking opportunities and hearing not only from people that we know, but they actually learn more by meeting new people that they can bring into respectability.
Really? Yeah, we testified and there would be a lot of ideas for me. Yeah, so be in touch with me. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Love it.
Crystal.
Yes.
Great.
Yes. Yeah. I'd love it. So Lauren and Philip have their teams for the board.
How many times did you change the battery here?
At least 3 times.
I expected much more.
The second battery we got, like they said, didn't last as long. Like the Canon batteries, I guess, lasted.
Yeah. Was it rechargeable?
Yeah.
We should go and network.
Network some more. I just also don't have to stay here for a long time. I'll be back in
Are they gonna give us dinner? I don't think it's dinner. It's like 6 when they're.
See if they'll pay for it.
I'm gonna join the conversation. So
I'll put them home. I'll put them home.
nah, she's gonna take over the conversation. She's too good at talking. I don't know. I'm gonna get food first.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. I was out there most of Now, are you going to caption as well? Yeah.
I have like 3 different story ideas that I can't put together right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's where
You're good.
I was just watching.
I want to introduce you to someone. First,
Yeah, right. Good luck to you. There you go. Right. Excuse me, miss? Miss.
Yeah, let me help you out. Yeah. This looks like I can make this. Are you trying to get to the door?
No, just the line.
Do you want me to?
Somebody has their computer on the floor, right?
my business.
Yeah. I was like, as a practice, I don't sound like other young people who's going to communicate. Well, he's local, so. Yes. I figured that makes sense. Have a good night. Enjoy it. Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is like stated on. Yeah, this is like that. Yeah. Something to do. I know.
Wait, did I ever stop any of this? What the crap?
I don't know. I really,